Section 1. The show that was almost never born. The hidden origin story. There is a story that gets told about Family Guy all the time. You have probably heard some version of it. A young guy with a funny idea pitches a cartoon to a network. The cartoon becomes a massive hit. People fall in love with it. The end. Clean, simple, easy to package into a Wikipedia summary. But the real story is messier and stranger and far more interesting than that. The real story involves a network that tried to bury the show before it ever had a chance to breathe. A creator who nearly missed the premiere of his own series for a reason that has nothing to do with animation. A time slot war that felt almost deliberately designed to make the show fail. And a resurrection that rewrote the rules of what was even possible in the television industry. The origin of Family Guy is not a success story. It is, in a very real way, a survival story. Go back to the late 1990s. Seth MacFarlane is a young man from Kent, Connecticut. He studied at the Rhode Island School of Design, and by the time he graduated, he had already been working in animation for a few years. He worked at Hanna-Barbera on shows like Johnny Bravo and Dexter's Laboratory. He was young, energetic, and he had been building something in the background of his professional life that he thought might be worth something. Two short animated films. One called The Life of Larry, one called Larry and Steve. These were rough little things, handmade and personal, featuring a heavy-set middle-aged guy and his talking dog. They were not polished productions. They were not going to win any awards. But they had something. A voice, an energy. A very specific kind of humor that felt different from most of what was on television at the time. MacFarlane took those two shorts, stripped them down, rebuilt them into something bigger, and added a family around the two central figures. The heavy-set man became Peter Griffin. The dog became Brian. And around them, MacFarlane constructed Lois, Meg, Chris, and that baby, that extraordinary baby, who would talk like a villain from a British period piece and spend his days plotting the downfall of his own mother. The show was called Family Guy. MacFarlane pitched it to Fox with a 15-minute animated pilot. He did all the voices himself in that room. He was 24 years old. The Fox executive who heard the pitch, a man named Mike Darnell, reportedly said afterward that he could not tell if MacFarlane was crazy or a genius. He gave MacFarlane roughly $40,000 to make a short proof-of-concept animation. MacFarlane came back with something good enough to get a series order. Here is the first secret most people do not know. Seth MacFarlane almost died before Family Guy ever aired. On September 11, 2001, two planes were hijacked and flown into the World Trade Center in New York. This is a matter of public record. What is less widely known is that MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11 that morning, one of the two planes used in the attacks. He had been out the night before and his travel agent had given him the wrong departure time. He arrived at Logan Airport in Boston roughly 10 minutes after the flight had already pushed back from the gate. He was told he had missed his plane. He left the airport. Hours later, that plane was flown into the North Tower. MacFarlane has spoken about this in interviews over the years. He knows, in a way that very few people have to know, exactly how close the distance between existing and not existing really is. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999. The time slot it was given was extraordinary. Fox placed it immediately after Super Bowl 33, one of the most watched television events of the year. The game attracted a massive audience, and millions of those viewers stayed on the channel after the final whistle and watched this strange new cartoon about a fat man, his wife, his kids, and a talking dog who drank martinis. 22 million people watched that first episode. That is a number that most television shows will never see in their entire run, let alone their first night. By any measure, Family Guy had arrived, and then Fox started doing something that looked, from the outside, very much like sabotage. During its first two seasons, the show was moved. Not once, not twice, but several times. In its second season, Fox took Family Guy out of its comfortable Sunday night slot and moved it to Thursday nights at 9 p.m. Thursday nights in 1999 were not a quiet corner of the television schedule. Thursday nights were the battleground. NBC had built an empire there. The specific problem was a show called Frasier, a sophisticated urban comedy that had been running since 1993 and was consistently one of the highest-rated programs on American television. Family Guy was thrown headfirst into competition with a show that had a deeply loyal, established audience. The ratings dropped. Fox moved the show again, this time to Tuesday nights. Tuesday nights in 1999 and 2000 presented a different problem in the form of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, a BC's runaway game show phenomenon that was at the absolute peak of its cultural dominance. The show was airing multiple nights a week at this point and pulling in audiences that almost nothing else on television could match. Family Guy got beaten again. The numbers kept sliding. Season 3 got even worse. The show was placed on Thursday nights again, competing this time with the combined firepower of Survivor and Friends. If you were designing a schedule specifically intended to crush a show that was struggling to find its footing, you would have placed it exactly where Fox placed Family Guy during these years. Whether that was intentional network politics or simply careless scheduling depends on who you ask. But the effect was the same. The audience that had shown up for that Super Bowl premiere could not find the show from one season to the next because it kept moving. You cannot build a loyal viewership if your loyal viewers cannot figure out when you are on. By 2002, Fox had made its decision. Family Guy was canceled. The final episode of the third season aired in July 2001, and a remaining unaired episode, a controversial one called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, was left on the shelf entirely. The show was over. The writing staff scattered. MacFarlane moved on to other projects. The characters went quiet. It looked, by any reasonable measure, like the end. But here is where the story turns into something that almost never happens. The rights to air reruns of Family Guy were sold to Cartoon Network for broadcast on their Adult Swim late-night block. And Fox sold those rights for what industry sources later described as nearly nothing. The network that had made the show, the network that had shuffled it around its schedule until it fell apart, gave away the rerun rights as though they were worthless. They genuinely believed, at that moment, that Family Guy had no future value. The reruns started airing on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003. And something unexpected happened. The show became the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim block. The viewership numbers were not just good, they were stunning. Adult Swim saw its overall viewership increase by 239% in the period following Family Guy's arrival. The audience that Fox had been unable to find for 3 seasons was there all along. It had just been asleep at the time slot Fox had been offering. Late-night audiences on cable, largely young men between 18 and 34, found the show and absolutely loved it. At the same time, something else was happening. The DVD market in the early 2000s was growing rapidly, and Family Guy was one of the shows that benefited most from it. The first season DVD sold over 2.2 million copies, making it the second best-selling television DVD release at the time, right behind the first season of Chappelle's Show. People were not just watching the reruns. They were buying the show, lending it to friends, rewatching it, memorizing it, building the kind of relationship with it that you only build with something that matters to you. Fox saw the numbers. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice, that had sold its rerun rights for almost nothing because they thought it had no value, started reconsidering. By 2004, they had made the decision to order new episodes. A 4th season was going to happen. The show was coming back. In the history of American television, the revival of Family Guy stands as one of the most dramatic examples of an audience refusing to accept a network's decision. The show did not come back because Fox suddenly recognized its quality. The show came back because the audience made it financially impossible for Fox to keep it canceled. MacFarlane himself later described the feeling of getting the call from the network. In an interview about the Season 4 premiere, he recalled being summoned to Fox and being told, in those words, that they wanted to sneak Family Guy back into production. He said he could barely believe what he was hearing. He had made peace with the show being gone. He had started moving forward, and now the network that had canceled him twice was asking him to come back. There are layers to this story that get lost when people talk about it. The show's rocky early history had already started changing it in ways that nobody fully understood at the time. The writing staff that had built those first 3 seasons did not wait around for 3 years. They moved on. New jobs, new shows, new projects. When Family Guy came back for Season 4, the room was not the same room that had made the early episodes. Some of the voices that had shaped the show were gone. New writers were coming in, and those new writers, talented as they may have been, brought different sensibilities to the table, different instincts, different ideas about what was funny and what was too far and what the show was supposed to feel like. The comeback had already planted the seeds of a change that would only become visible as the years went on. The fourth season premiere aired on May 1st, 2005, and drew an audience of 11.85 million viewers, the best ratings the show had seen since the first season. The audience had been waiting, and they showed up. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. Could be 2 a.m., could be a Sunday afternoon. And if you are new here, hit subscribe. It is completely free and it genuinely helps this channel grow. Now let us keep going because the story is only just getting interesting. Section 2. The Cancellation Conspiracies. Was Family Guy deliberately buried by Fox? When you lay out the full timeline of what Fox did to Family Guy during its first 3 seasons, a pattern emerges that is difficult to explain as simple bad luck or corporate incompetence. The more carefully you look at it, the more it looks like a company that did not know what it had, and in not knowing, kept putting its most valuable new property in positions almost guaranteed to fail. Whether that rises to the level of conspiracy is a matter of perspective, but the facts, laid out plainly, are striking. Consider the timing first. Family Guy premiered in January 1999 in the most coveted slot on all of American television. Post-Super Bowl. A slot that networks pay enormous sums to occupy, that studios fight over, that agents dream about for their clients. The show attracted 22 million viewers and received strong reviews. Any rational network executive looking at those numbers would have done everything possible to protect that show's trajectory. You would lock in a stable time slot. You would give it consistent promotion. You would build an audience that knows where to find you. These are the basic mechanics of building a successful television series. Fox did the opposite. Within months, the show was moved. And it was not moved to a quiet corner of the schedule where it could grow quietly. It was moved directly into competition with Frasier. Now, Frasier by 1999 was not just a popular show, it was a television institution. It had won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series for a record 5 consecutive years at that point. It had a deeply loyal, upscale, educated audience that had been watching it for 6 years. It was exactly the kind of established competitor that a new show with a young, still-forming audience should not be placed against until it has had time to build its own foundation. The question is, did anyone at Fox not understand this? Or did they understand it perfectly and not particularly care? There is a theory that has floated around television journalism circles for years, though it rarely gets stated as boldly as it deserves to be stated. The theory goes something like this. Fox Broadcasting and Fox News are both components of the same corporate structure that was, at the time, controlled by News Corp and the broader Murdoch media empire. Family Guy from its very first season was a show that mocked Fox News and made jokes at the expense of conservative media and political figures associated with the Fox brand. Seth MacFarlane was, and remains, openly politically liberal. The show reflected that. And there are people who have suggested, carefully and with caveats, that the uncomfortable relationship between the show's political sensibility and the network's broader political identity may have had something to do with why the scheduling decisions went the way they did. This is difficult to prove and easy to dismiss, but it becomes harder to dismiss when you place it next to what MacFarlane himself has said over the years about his relationship with Fox. In 2021, he made his feelings extremely public. He posted to social media that Tucker Carlson's commentary made him wish Family Guy was on any other network. He framed it as a failing marriage, explicitly comparing his relationship with Fox to a situation where both parties knew it was not working anymore. This was not some off-the-cuff remark. This was a considered, public statement from the creator of one of the network's longest-running and most profitable shows. He had already signed a $200 million deal with NBC Universal the previous year, moving his production company away from the Fox ecosystem entirely. The man was telling the world that he did not want to be associated with the network that had carried his show for over 2 decades. You do not reach that level of public frustration overnight. You do not wake up one morning and decide to publicly express your wish that your creation was on a different network unless something has been building for a long time. And when you trace that frustration backward, it reaches all the way to those early scheduling decisions, to those unexplained time slot changes, to the network's choice to place a new and vulnerable show in impossible competitive positions season after season. There is another thread worth pulling. When Family Guy was canceled, for the second time in 2002, Fox sold the rerun rights to Cartoon Network for what multiple sources have described as almost nothing. The president of 20th Century Fox Television later described the transaction in terms that suggest Fox did not believe the show had any residual value whatsoever. They were essentially giving the rights away. This is the same company that had already seen 22 million people watch the show's premiere. This is the same company that had received solid ratings in the first season. They knew this show had an audience somewhere. The decision to dispose of the rerun rights so cheaply either reflects a level of corporate dismissiveness that borders on negligence, or it reflects something else. Perhaps a desire to make sure the show did not come back through the back door of syndication and embarrass the network that had killed it. When the Adult Swim numbers came back and the DVD sales came back and it became impossible to argue that the audience was not there, Fox reversed course. And the reversal was swift and enthusiastic. Suddenly, this show that had been canceled twice was being promoted as a major event, placed on Sunday nights in animation domination alongside The Simpsons, given the resources and the attention it had been denied during its original run. The network's behavior toward Family Guy changed so completely and so quickly that it further supports the idea that the original neglect was not about quality or even ratings alone. Because if the show was not worth investing in during its original run, why was it suddenly worth investing in so heavily the moment audience data made dismissal impossible? McFarlane's response to the revival is interesting in its own right. He was gracious in public about the network's decision to bring the show back. He expressed genuine surprise and gratitude. But the show itself told a different story. The first episode of Season 4, titled North by North Quahog, opens with Peter informing his family that they have been canceled because Fox needed to clear their schedule for new shows. He lists off a string of Fox shows that had recently been canceled, then says essentially, if all those shows fail, we might have a shot. It is a joke, delivered in McFarlane's deadpan style, but it is also a message. A creator using his own show to tell the network that canceled him twice exactly what he thought of them, wrapped in just enough plausible deniability to avoid a legal conversation. The Season 4 premiere of Family Guy was not just a television event. It was, in its own small way, a power shift. The show that Fox had tried to discard had come back with more cultural heat than almost anything else on the network. The network needed the show more than the show needed the network at that point, and McFarlane knew it. He had leverage he had not had before, and you could feel it in every self-referential joke about cancellation that made its way into those early revival episodes. There is a darker layer to the conspiracy theory as well, one that involves the show's content rather than its scheduling. During the original run, Family Guy had already begun attracting the attention of groups that monitored broadcast content. The Parents Television Council placed the show on its list of worst primetime programs for family viewing multiple times. The Federal Communications Commission received numerous complaints about specific episodes. Fox was getting pressure from advertiser-adjacent watchdog organizations about the content of a show they had created and were broadcasting. Some television historians who have studied the era have suggested that this pressure may have made it easier for Fox to quietly let the show fail by simply not giving it the scheduling support it needed. No single dramatic cancellation, no controversy, just a gradual slide into ratings oblivion through competitive placement, and then a clean corporate exit dressed up as a business decision. Whether any of that is true is impossible to say with certainty, but the cumulative weight of the evidence, the scheduling decisions, the cheap disposal of rerun rights, the swift reversal once audience data made dismissal impossible, McFarlane's own public statements about the network, the show's own internal jokes about its treatment at the hands of Fox, all of it tells a story that is more complicated than the official narrative. The official narrative says Fox canceled a show that was not getting ratings, then brought it back when the market made a compelling financial case. The real story says a show was placed in positions designed to ensure it would struggle, then discarded as worthless, then retrieved and repackaged once someone else had done the work of proving its value. The difference between those two stories matters, because one is about business and the other is about power. What is undeniable is that the 3 years Family Guy spent off the air changed it permanently. The writing staff that came back was not the writing staff that left. The tone that returned was not quite the tone that had departed. The warmth that the early episodes carried, that genuine sense of a family that was chaotic but loved each other, had already begun to thin out before the show even came back. The cancellation conspiracy, whether it was real or imagined, had real consequences for the show's identity. The show that returned in 2005 was already carrying scars that would only deepen as the seasons progressed. And the network that had created those scars was about to become a recurring character in the show's story, appearing again and again in ways that would shape what Family Guy could and could not do, what it would and would not say, and ultimately who it would and would not be allowed to become. The relationship between Seth MacFarlane and Fox Broadcasting is one of the most quietly contentious creator-network relationships in the history of American television. And it is a relationship that the fans who watch the show every week were almost never told the full truth about. Section 3. The censored episodes. What Fox never wanted you to see. There is an entire category of Family Guy history that most casual fans have never had access to, and that the network has never been particularly eager to discuss in detail. These are the episodes that were written, produced, animated, and then held back, forbidden from broadcast, locked away while the rest of the season aired around them, their absence barely acknowledged, their existence confirmed only through leaks, DVD releases, and the occasional press statement carefully worded to say as little as possible. These are the episodes that crossed a line that Fox decided, in its corporate judgment, could not be crossed on American broadcast television. And the stories behind why each of them was banned are more revealing than the episodes themselves. The first major episode to run into serious trouble was called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. It was written for the third season and was originally intended to air in 2000. It did not air on Fox until 2004. 4 years. The episode sat on a shelf for 4 years while the show was canceled and revived and the world moved on around it. The reason Fox gave was that the episode might be interpreted as anti-Semitic. The episode centers on Peter Griffin deciding that Jewish people are better at handling money than everyone else, and that Chris should convert to Judaism in order to be more financially successful. The joke, which the writers always maintained, was a satire of anti-Semitic stereotypes, rather than an endorsement of them, was built around Peter's ignorance and the absurdity of his reasoning. The episode features a musical number called I Need a Jew, a parody of the famous Pinocchio song When You Wish Upon a Star. That parody song would later be the subject of a lawsuit filed by Bourne Company music publishers in 2007, which alleged that the parody infringed on their copyright. A federal judge dismissed the lawsuit in 2009, ruling that the parody was a legitimate First Amendment-protected form of expression because it was clearly transforming the original work for comedic commentary rather than simply reproducing it. But long before any lawsuit, the episode was simply gone. Fox had looked at it, decided the content posed a risk, and pulled it from the broadcast schedule without any public explanation. It aired on Adult Swim first in November 2003 without Fox's blessing as part of the syndication deal that Cartoon Network had acquired. Fox eventually broadcast it in December 2004, roughly a year and a half after its Adult Swim debut, and roughly 4 years after it had originally been intended to air. MacFarlane's own take on the ban was characteristically dry. Before one of the Adult Swim airings, he reportedly described the episode as the one Fox refused to air because they felt it was too risky. He then added that by too risky, they seemed to mean anything that did not feature a certain socialite half-naked on a car hood. The joke was sharp and pointed, and said everything he thought about the network's reasoning without technically saying it at all. The second banned episode is the more complicated and more enduring case. It was called Partial Terms of Endearment. It was written for the 8th season, and it has never aired on American broadcast television. Not on Fox, not on Adult Swim, not anywhere on American screens in its entirety. It is available on DVD and on digital retailers, and it aired on BBC Three in the United Kingdom in June 2010. But for American audiences, it remains, to this day, a ghost episode, known to exist but inaccessible through normal channels. The episode was written by Danny Smith, a longtime Family Guy writer, and it deals with the subject of abortion. Not obliquely, not through metaphor, directly. The story involves Lois agreeing to be a surrogate mother for an old college friend. When the friend and her husband are killed in a car accident, Lois is left pregnant and facing a decision about what to do. The episode takes the subject seriously while still being a comedy. It engages with the actual arguments on both sides of the debate, including a scene where Peter encounters anti-abortion protesters and begins to agree with their position before the logic collapses under examination. And it ends with Lois making a decision, specifically choosing to have an abortion, a narrative choice that most American network television had never, and has still never been willing to make in explicit terms. When the episode was completed, Fox exercised their contractual right to decline to broadcast it. MacFarlane had been warned during production that the subject matter was flagging concern in the network's standards department, but he had expected the same outcome as with the Weinstein episode, that after some delay and renegotiation, the episode would eventually air. He told the New York Times at the time that he genuinely believed things would work out, and that most of these situations turned out to be nothing. He was wrong. Fox released a statement saying that it fully supported the producers' right to make the episode and distribute it in whatever way they wanted. They just declined to air it themselves. Adult Swim was also approached about airing the episode and also declined. This was unusual. Adult Swim had been the safety valve for Family Guy's more controversial content before, having aired the Weinstein episode when Fox would not. The fact that they passed on partial terms of endearment suggested the content was genuinely in a different category. What made this particularly interesting from a creative and political standpoint was the timing. The episode was announced at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009 before Season 8 had even aired. MacFarlane and the writers were essentially announcing in advance that one of their episodes was going to be banned. The press event around the episode, which included a live table read before an audience that MacFarlane later somewhat mischievously admitted was largely composed of Emmy voters he was trying to court, became a media story in its own right. Fox was hosting the event while simultaneously refusing to broadcast the content being read aloud at it. The absurdity of that situation was not lost on anyone in the room. Several critics who saw the episode, either at the table read or later through the BBC broadcast or the DVD release, noted that it was genuinely less inflammatory than Fox's response suggested. The episode does not take a simple advocacy position. It shows the complexity of the issue through the specific circumstances of Lois's situation and the pressure she faces from multiple directions. Some critics argued that it was actually one of the more thoughtful treatments of the subject that American popular entertainment had ever attempted. A television critic for Salin wrote at the time that it was genuinely astonishing that it took Family Guy, of all shows, to be one of the few pieces of American popular culture brave enough to address the topic directly, and that Fox's refusal to air it said something depressing about how far the country still had to go. MacFarlane put it his own way in the New York Times. He said he thought that if the same episode had been made for a show like House rather than for an animated comedy, it probably would have aired without any trouble at all. The implication was that the network's objection was not purely about content, but about context, about the cultural perception that a show like Family Guy addressing a subject this serious would be taken differently, more provocatively, more politically charged than a medical drama doing the same thing. The subject was acceptable. The vessel delivering it was the problem. Beyond these two fully banned episodes, there is a long history of individual scenes and segments being cut or altered for broadcast. The episode PTV, which was literally made as a satire of television censorship following the Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake Super Bowl halftime show incident, was itself subject to cuts that removed content from the broadcast version. The DVD releases of multiple episodes contain scenes that never made it to air, including alternate dialogue, extended sequences, and on at least one occasion, an entirely different ending to a storyline. The episode Road to Rhode Island, which became one of the most watched and most quoted early Family Guy episodes, contains an airport security scene in which Stewie sings a song and distracts the guards from noticing the weapons in his luggage. The full version of the scene was trimmed for broadcast. The episode Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, released as a DVD special in 2005, contains scenes of Peter and Lois behaving intimately that were significantly altered for broadcast, with clothing added and dialogue changed, when portions of the material were later incorporated into regular episodes. There is also the strange case of a scene in the episode The Splendid Source, which involves the family searching for the origin of a particularly crude joke that got Chris in trouble at school. The actual joke, which the episode builds toward across its entire running time, was included in the original production but was removed from the broadcast version. Viewers who watched the episode on Fox never heard the punchline to the story they had been watching for 20 minutes. The full version exists on DVD, and the joke is indeed extremely coarse. But the structural absurdity of broadcasting an episode that builds to a joke it then refuses to deliver illustrates something important about the relationship between the show and its network. Fox was willing to use the premise to profit from the advertising that surrounded the episode, but not willing to let the audience actually experience the complete version of what the writers had made. The censorship history of Family Guy is not just a collection of funny anecdotes about executives being squeamish. It is a record of the ongoing negotiation between a creative team that was consistently trying to push television into uncomfortable territory and a corporate structure that needed to balance that creative ambition against advertiser relationships and regulatory environments and political pressures that had nothing to do with whether the art was good. The show that made it to your screen was always a compromise version. The show that existed in its raw intended form lived in writing rooms and recording booths and editing bays, and was only ever partially released into the world. Knowing that changes how you think about what Family Guy was and what it was trying to be. Every episode that felt like it was holding something back, every punch that seemed pulled, every joke that built towards something and then flinched at the last second, had a history behind it. A conversation in a network office, a set of standards notes, a decision made by someone whose job was not to make the show better, but to make it safer. Family Guy, at its most interesting, was always a show that was fighting against forces trying to contain it. And those forces won more often than the audience ever knew. Section 4. The Brian Death Cover-Up. A calculated rating stunt that fooled the world. There are television moments that genuinely shock you. Moments where something happens on a show you love, and your immediate response is disbelief. Not because you find it implausible as storytelling, but because you find it unacceptable as an experience. The death of Brian Griffin in November 2013 was one of those moments for millions of Family Guy fans. And the story behind that death, the real story, the one that took several weeks to fully emerge, is one of the most transparent and most successfully executed manipulation campaigns in the history of American animated television. Here is what happened on the surface. Season 12, Episode 6, Life of Brian. The episode begins with what appears to be a normal Family Guy episode. Brian and Stewie spend time together. Stewie destroys his time machine, establishing explicitly and with unusual narrative emphasis that time travel is no longer an option for him. Then Brian is hit by a car while retrieving a ball in the street. The accident is shown with unusual realism and without the comedic deflection that characterizes most physical harm in the show. The family grieves. The episode ends with a new dog, Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of Sopranos fame, being brought home to fill the void. There are no jokes about it, no cutaway gags to punctuate the sadness. The show played it straight. Brian was dead. The internet reacted as though someone had actually died. Not a cartoon character, not a fictional dog on a show known for resetting its status quo every episode, but an actual living creature. Twitter produced a trending topic within hours. A Change.org petition calling for Brian's return gathered over 100,000 signatures. News organizations filed stories about the death of a cartoon dog as though it were a cultural event, because at that moment, it essentially was. The Hollywood Reporter covered it. Rolling Stone covered it. Entertainment publications that had not taken Family Guy seriously as a news subject in years were suddenly filing urgent pieces about whether this was really happening. Behind the scenes, the truth was already being managed very carefully. Executive producer Steve Callahan told reporters that the death was a fun way to shake things up. He did not say it was permanent. He did not say it was temporary. He was doing what television executives do when they have planned a stunt and want to maximize its impact without legally lying to anyone. He was being deliberately vague in a way designed to sustain the emotional experience of the audience for as long as possible. Oh yeah. Every day that the internet was talking about Brian's death was a day that Family Guy was in the cultural conversation in a way it had not been in years. The show at the time was genuinely struggling in the ratings. The season 12 premiere had drawn an audience down roughly 21% from the previous year. The show had been on the air for over a decade. Long-running shows face a specific challenge that younger shows do not. The cultural assumption that because they have been around forever, there is nothing they would not have already done. The element of surprise disappears. The sense that anything could happen fades away. Family Guy in 2013 was fighting that perception. Brian's death was the weapon they chose to fight it with. MacFarlane was not the architect of the stunt in the day-to-day sense. By 2013, he had stepped back significantly from the writing room. But he was not absent from the conversation, and his response after the truth came out revealed exactly how calculated the whole operation had been. When Brian came back to life in the Christmas episode just 2 weeks later, a Stewie uses time travel revival that directly contradicted the earlier episode's explicit establishment that time travel was no longer possible, MacFarlane went to social media and posted something that has become one of the most quoted remarks in the show's history. He wrote that he did not think anyone would really believe they had killed off Brian, and added that to do so would require being high. He followed it with a thank you to fans for caring so much about the character. In an interview with The Hollywood Reporter shortly after, MacFarlane acknowledged directly that the stunt had been calibrated for effect. He said the team had been surprised by the intensity of the fan reaction, that they had expected some conversation but not the genuine outrage that erupted. He also said the move had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had reminded people that the show was still capable of surprising them, that after more than a decade on the air, it was still a show where anything could happen. That is a revealing piece of language. It reminded people. Not it showed them or it proved to them. Reminded. As though the capacity for surprise was always there and the audience had simply forgotten about it. The death of Brian was not a creative decision made because the story required it or because the character had run his natural course. It was a marketing decision designed to re-engage an audience that ratings data suggested was drifting away. And it worked. The episode that brought Brian back had significantly better numbers than the surrounding episodes in the season. The mechanics of the stunt also reveal how far in advance these things are planned. The production schedule for an animated television show runs many months ahead of broadcast. The episode in which Brian died and the episode in which he was revived were almost certainly in production simultaneously, or very close to it. The writers, the voice cast, the animation team, all of them knew that Brian was coming back before the audience had any idea Brian was going to die. The entire exercise was theater. A controlled performance of grief designed to generate real emotional responses in people who did not know they were watching theater. This is not necessarily a condemnation. Television is full of manufactured moments. Cliffhangers are manufactured. Season finales are manufactured. The entire architecture of episodic storytelling is built on the deliberate manipulation of audience expectation. What made the Brian death stunt feel different to many fans was the specific way in which the show played the grief straight, without its usual deflection, in a way that seemed designed to make you forget, even briefly, that you were watching an animated comedy that had been on for over a decade and where nothing ever had permanent consequences. There is also the question of what the stunt did to Vinny, the replacement dog. Vinny was played by Tony Sirico, who was genuinely funny in the role. The character had a specific energy, a working-class Italian Catholic warmth, that was completely different from Brian's affected literary persona. Some fans, in the weeks between the two episodes, began to genuinely enjoy Vinny as a character. They had allowed themselves to imagine what the show might look like with this new presence in it. And then all of it was erased. Vinny vanished from the show within a handful of episodes, his contract apparently limited, his character disposed of as quickly as he had been introduced. The audience that had started to invest in him was simply dropped. MacFarlane, writing from the creative sideline, later said in a Reddit AMA that the size of the fan reaction to Brian's death surprised him genuinely. He framed it as evidence that people still cared about the character deeply, which he described as a good thing. What he did not say was that the reaction also revealed something less flattering, that the show had spent years making Brian progressively more arrogant, more hypocritical, and less likable. And yet the audience's attachment to him remained so strong that the idea of losing him permanently felt catastrophic. That is not a testament to the character as he had become. It is a testament to who he used to be. The fans were not mourning the Brian of Season 12. They were mourning the Brian of Season 2. And the show's creative team used that grief to boost its ratings while barely acknowledging the irony. The Brian death episode is studied now in discussions about audience manipulation and creator-audience relationships in popular entertainment. It represents a very specific kind of trust violation, one where the tools of genuine emotional storytelling were borrowed and used in the service of a temporary ratings exercise, then returned to the shelf as though nothing had happened. The audience was told implicitly that its feelings were valuable, and they were, but only for the 3 weeks they were useful as a promotional asset. Section 5, The Hidden Meg, what the producers never admitted. There is a character on Family Guy who functions, across roughly 10 seasons of the show's run, as a kind of emotional punching bag for the entire cast. She is the oldest Griffin child, a teenage girl named Meg, voiced since the second season by Mila Kunis. The treatment of this character across the show's post-revival seasons is one of the most prolonged and systematic depictions of abuse directed at a single character in the history of American animated comedy. And the most interesting part of it is not what happened on screen, but what the producers spent years refusing to acknowledge about why it happened and what it meant. In the first 3 seasons of the show, Meg was a straightforward character. She was a teenager. She was unpopular at school. She wanted to be liked and found that difficult. In a family full of extraordinary personalities, she was the ordinary one, and the humor surrounding her came from that contrast. She was not a great target of cruelty. She was just relatively invisible, which is its own kind of comment about how teenage girls often experience the world. Something changed after the show returned in 2005. The writers, looking for places to push harder with the comedy, discovered that making Meg the target of contempt from everyone around her got a response from audiences. It was an easy laugh. You could have Peter say something horrible to her and the audience would laugh, not necessarily because they found the cruelty funny in itself, but because the escalation, the gap between what a father should say to his daughter and what Peter was saying, created a jarring comic incongruity. The writers found this well and they went back to it. And then they went back to it again, and again. By the time the show was in its later seasons, Meg was being routinely subjected to things that had moved well past jarring comedy into something else entirely. Peter would physically harm her. He would express wishes that she did not exist. The family would collectively pile onto her for entertainment. Random strangers would react to her presence with disgust. The town of the show seemed to have unanimously agreed that Meg was beneath contempt, and the show invited the audience to join in on that agreement. One famous recurring gag involved Peter using Meg as an object of sexual humiliation, farting at her or pressing her face against him in ways that are genuinely difficult to describe without the language becoming quite dark. Flashbacks were used to reveal that Peter and Lois had attempted to abandon Meg at a fire station as a baby. This was played for laughs. The writers and producers for years maintained a position in interviews and press appearances that all of this was simply part of the show's dark comedic identity, that Meg was not being victimized so much as playing a specific structural role in the family dynamic, and that this was no different from the kind of things that happened to every character on the show. The problem with this defense was that it was not true. No other character on the show was subjected to anything approaching what Meg was subjected to in terms of persistence, intimacy, and escalation. Stewie got to be evil. Brian got to be sophisticated. Chris got to be clueless. Peter got to be reckless. Lois got to be long-suffering. Meg got to be abused. That is not a parallel list. Those are not equivalent character functions. The most revealing moment in the show's relationship with Meg came in the 10th season episode Seahorse Seashell Party. In this episode, Meg finally breaks. She confronts her family and tells them exactly what they have done to her. The speech covers Peter's irresponsibility, Lois's coldness, Chris's cruelty, Brian's complicity. It is a raw piece of writing, clearly motivated by the same self-awareness that occasionally showed itself in the show's best moments. The audience watching it felt something like relief. Here, at last, was an acknowledgement. The show was going to reckon with what it had been doing. And then the episode ends with Meg voluntarily taking it all back. She tells Brian that she understands her function in the family now, that she is the one who absorbs everyone else's negativity so that the family can function, and that going back to that role is something she accepts. The episode frames this as Meg achieving a kind of wisdom, as understanding something about herself and her family that she had not understood before. But what she understands is that the system that was abusing her works better with her complicity than without it. And the episode wants the audience to find that resolution meaningful rather than horrifying. Fans noticed. The episode generated significant negative reaction, not for the confrontation scene, but for the ending. The complaint was not that the scene was poorly written. The writing in it was actually quite sharp. The complaint was about what the episode was communicating, that victims should accept their victimization if it serves the people around them. That standing up for yourself is selfish. That being the one everyone hurts is a role you can make peace with if you frame it the right way. Whether the writers intended to communicate those messages is beside the point. That is what the episode said. The real cover-up in the Meg story is the production side. For years, the people making the show gave interviews suggesting that the escalating abuse was a deliberate creative choice, a commentary on how teenage girls are treated, a sustained satirical examination of family dysfunction. In reality, the escalation appears to have been driven by something much simpler. It was easy, it got laughs, and nobody in the room was pushing back hard enough against it. The change that eventually reduced the Meg abuse, which came gradually around seasons 14 and 15, is widely attributed to the addition of more women to the writing staff of the show. When writers who had personal experience with what it felt like to be in Meg's position started having more influence over the room, the dynamic changed. Not because someone issued a mandate or had a moral awakening, but because the demographics of the room shifted and the show followed. The fact that the change came from staffing rather than from the creative team's own evolving values tells you everything. The Meg abuse did not stop because the producers recognized it had gone too far. It stopped because the people making the decisions changed. That is an institutional story as much as a creative one. And the producers who spent years defending the abuse as intentional satire have never quite reckoned publicly with the gap between that defense and the reality that they stopped doing it, not because they had said everything they wanted to say about teenage isolation and family cruelty, but because different people were in the room. Mila Kunis, who has voiced Meg since the second season, has discussed in interviews the strange experience of being the voice of a character that people treat with contempt in a very direct and personal way. She has described having strangers approach her and repeat dismissive catchphrases that were associated with Meg's abuse on the show, directed at her personally, at the real woman, as though the character's status on the show granted them permission to treat the actress the same way. The fictional cruelty, repeated often enough and endorsed loudly enough, developed a real-world gravity that pulled actual behavior in its direction. The hidden truth about Meg is not that the show was secretly doing something sophisticated with her character. The hidden truth is that the show used her for a decade in a way it was not willing to be honest about in real time. That the justifications offered for what was happening were largely post hoc rationalizations for decisions made in the moment for simpler reasons, and that the eventual improvement in her treatment was an accident of staffing rather than a product of moral clarity. The show that occasionally claimed to be making a point about teenage suffering was, most of the time, just making entertainment out of it. Section 6. The Stewie Sexuality Mystery. The answer they always avoided. Stewie Griffin is one of the most debated minor mysteries in American popular culture. Not major mysteries, not political scandals or unsolved crimes. But in the specific universe of television character secrets, the question of Stewie's sexuality has occupied an unusual amount of space in the cultural conversation around Family Guy for over 2 decades. And the reason the question has been so persistent is that the show's creators gave different answers at different times, and those answers were always calibrated to serve the show's immediate comedic needs, rather than any underlying commitment to telling the truth about who the character was. In the early seasons, Stewie's sexuality was not really a central question. He was an evil infant. He wanted to kill his mother and conquer the world. Whether he would grow up to be attracted to men or women was not a pressing concern when his primary interest was building lasers in his crib. But as the show evolved and Stewie's character shifted away from supervillain and towards something more emotionally complex, his personal identity, including his sexuality, became an increasingly dominant part of how he was written. By the middle seasons, virtually every episode with a significant Stewie component included at least one reference to his possible attraction to men, his comfort in feminine dress, or his confusion about his own identity. The writers were doing something clever, or what they thought was clever. By keeping Stewie's sexuality permanently ambiguous, they could have it both ways. They could write him as a gay character, or a character strongly coded as gay, and collect all the comedic benefits of that portrayal, while simultaneously avoiding the commitment of an explicit declaration that might have alienated certain viewers or created expectations the show did not want to fulfill. The vagueness was a feature, not a bug. It allowed the show to be inclusive and exclusive at the same time, to wink at one audience while keeping the door open for another. Seth MacFarlane spoke about this in a 2008 interview with The Advocate, a gay publication. He was remarkably candid. He said that the writers all felt that Stewie was almost certainly gay and that they had been writing him as though he were a gay character for years. He said they had never locked it in as a definitive fact because they got good jokes from both sides of the ambiguity. He speculated that Stewie, when he grows up, would end up either as a homosexual or as a very unhappy, repressed heterosexual. That last phrase, very unhappy, repressed heterosexual, is interesting. It suggests an awareness that there is something painful in the ambiguity for the character himself, not just for the audience trying to categorize him. MacFarlane also mentioned in the same interview that the writers had gotten to the script stage on an episode in which Stewie explicitly comes out of the closet. The episode would have involved Stewie going back in time to prevent a passage from Leviticus from being written, the scriptural passage most frequently cited in anti-gay religious arguments. The episode was apparently considered seriously enough to reach a finished script, then shelved. MacFarlane described the decision to keep Stewie's sexuality vague rather than definitive as something that made sense because he was a one-year-old, because the ambiguity added comedy, and because locking it in would close off certain story options. He later, in other contexts, walked some of this back, saying that as a cartoon character, Stewie could be neither straight nor gay in any definitive sense. This is the contradiction at the heart of the Stewie question. The creative team knew, or at least believed, that Stewie was gay. They wrote him as gay. They told interviewers he was essentially gay, and then they never committed to it on screen in any way that could not be walked back or reframed. The ambiguity was deliberate, yes, but it was also commercially motivated. A definitively gay baby character on a broadcast network show in the early 2000s would have attracted a specific kind of controversy that the show, already fighting for its survival against watchdog organizations and advertiser pressure, did not need. The vagueness protected the show's commercial relationships at the expense of honesty about who the character was. The closest the show ever came to a definitive answer was in the season 16 episode Send In, Stewie, Please, which aired in 2018. The episode is unusual in the history of Family Guy in that it aired completely without commercial interruption, a rarity for a network broadcast series. Stewie is in a therapy session with a British psychologist, and the episode consists almost entirely of the two characters talking, which for a show built on cutaways and rapid-fire gags was a radical formal departure. During the session, Stewie describes his sexuality as fluid. He questions whether the word heterosexual even refers to a real thing. The therapist, who is also British, immediately recognizes that Stewie's carefully constructed British accent is not actually his real voice, a revelation that adds another layer of performance and self-concealment to the character. The writer of the episode, Gary Janetti, spoke to TV Line after its broadcast and was clear that the episode was not intended as a coming-out story in any traditional sense. He said the show was addressing the things around the question of Stewie's sexuality without answering it directly, because the ambiguity was itself the most honest version of where the character was. He said that what the episode was really about was the journey Stewie still had to go on, a a journey that might include a great deal of repression and self-denial, and negotiation with an identity he was not fully ready to claim. The therapist in the episode does not survive the encounter. Stewie, protecting his secret, kills him. The show ends where it began. The question is still unanswered. The character is still in motion. And the commercial architecture of the ambiguity is still intact. The canceled script about Stewie coming out is worth thinking about more carefully. The writers were willing to imagine it. They got it to script stage. They made a deliberate choice not to make it. That choice was not about artistic integrity or the belief that ambiguity served the story better. It was about risk management. The show was already on Fox's watch list with various censorship and standards complaints. An animated infant coming out as gay on a broadcast network in the early 2000s would have generated a level of organized opposition that could have affected the show's renewals, its advertiser relationships, and its position in the network's scheduling priorities. The decision to keep Stewie's sexuality undefined was a business decision dressed in creative language. What is quietly remarkable is how many viewers and longtime fans understood this without being told. The Stewie sexuality question has never really been a mystery to people who watched the show closely. The answer was in the writing, in the performance, in the specific jokes and situations the writers chose to put the character in again and again. The mystery was only in the show's official position, in the press materials and the creator interviews and the network-approved public statements. The audience knew who Stewie was. The question was whether the show would ever have the courage to say it out loud. And the answer, it turned out, was mostly no, not quite, not definitively, not in a way that would cost them anything. Which, for a show that spent so many years telling itself it was brave, says something important about what bravery actually looked like when it had a price tag attached to it. Section 7. The McFarlane Departure. The truth behind the step. Back. There is a specific kind of loneliness in a television show that has outlasted its creator's passion for it. Not necessarily the passion for the characters or the world, but the day-to-day creative engagement that makes a show feel like someone is steering it with intention and care. Family Guy reached that state sometime around 2010, and the story of how it got there involves a creator who was pulled in dozens of directions at once. A network relationship that had become adversarial in ways both public and private, and a decision to step back from the writing room that changed the show in ways that took years to fully understand. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old when Family Guy premiered. He was the youngest executive producer of a major primetime show in television history at that point. He voiced Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. He was in the writing room. He had opinions about the jokes, the stories, the characters, the direction. He was everywhere in the show. When you watch a Season 1 or Season 2 episode, you are watching something that passed through his hands at essentially every stage. The show had a specific voice because one person was responsible for maintaining that voice across the entire production. That level of creative ownership is unusual in television, where shows are typically more collaborative and more diffuse in their creative hierarchies, and it was a large part of what made those early seasons feel so unified and specific. As the show grew, MacFarlane grew with it in ways that pulled him further from it. He created American Dad, which premiered in 2005, giving him a second show to oversee simultaneously. Then came The Cleveland Show in 2009, a third production, a spin-off of the show he had originally made. By the time the Cleveland spin-off launched, MacFarlane was at least nominally responsible for 3 animated series running concurrently on Fox. That is an extraordinary creative and logistical load for a single individual to carry, even with strong teams supporting each show. And then came the film work. Ted in 2012 was a massive commercial success, earning over $500 million worldwide and establishing MacFarlane as a filmmaker with genuine box office power. He co-wrote, directed, produced, and starred in it. A Million Ways to Die in the West followed in 2014, then Ted 2 in 2015. He hosted the Academy Awards in 2013. He developed The Orville, a science fiction series that premiered on Fox in 2017 before moving to Hulu. He released multiple albums of big band and jazz standards. He signed the $200 million deal with NBC Universal in 2020. He produced a live-action prequel series for his Ted property on Peacock that launched in 2024. MacFarlane revealed in a September 2017 Reddit AMA that he had not written for Family Guy since 2010. He was still doing voice work, still in the recording booth giving voice to Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire for every episode. But the writing, the story decisions, the creative oversight, all of that had been handed off. The showrunning duties had passed primarily to Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, who took over the day-to-day management of the series. These were capable professionals who had been with the show for years and knew its world intimately. But there is a specific kind of knowledge that a creator has about their own creation that cannot be transferred. It is not technical knowledge. It is not craft knowledge. It is something more like a felt sense of where the edges of the thing are, what it can sustain and what it cannot, what is in keeping with the show's spirit and what is a departure from it. Without MacFarlane in the room making those calls, the show drifted. The characters were pushed further. The humor became darker and less purposeful. The warmth that had always underlaid the chaos, even at its most dysfunctional, continued to fade. None of the showrunners who followed MacFarlane deliberately set out to make the show worse. But they were working from a blueprint they had inherited, rather than one they had drawn. And the difference between those two relationships to a creative project is visible in the work over time. MacFarlane's public comments about the show during this period were carefully measured. In a 2024 interview where he was asked about the show's future, he described its continued existence in terms that were telling in their practical framing. He said he did not see a good reason to stop making it because people still loved it and it made people happy. He mentioned that the show's revenue helped fund charitable causes he cared about, specifically environmental conservation work through organizations focused on rainforest preservation. These are perfectly respectable reasons to continue producing a show. They are also the reasons of a man who has made peace with a pragmatic relationship to something that once meant more to him on a purely creative level. He used the phrase escape velocity. He said the show had been running so long that there was no longer any logical reason to end it unless the audience stopped caring. The show was continuing because it had reached a kind of orbital momentum, because the economics and the infrastructure and the brand recognition all made continuation the path of least resistance. He did not say he had stories he was burning to tell. He did not mention creative directions he was excited to explore. The language was the language of business and inertia rather than the language of artistic intention. That is a very different Seth MacFarlane from the one who walked into a Fox executive's office at 24 years old and did all the voices himself and made someone think he was either crazy or a genius. That MacFarlane had a burning need to make this specific thing. The MacFarlane of 2024 had moved on to other burning needs and was maintaining a professional relationship with a creation that was still economically valuable and still, in its way, doing good in the world. The Writers Guild strikes further complicated the picture. During the 2007 to 2008 strike, MacFarlane was one of the most visible and vocal supporters of the striking writers. He walked the picket lines. He refused to complete work on episodes during the strike. And Fox, exercising their contractual rights, aired 3 episodes of Family Guy without his final approval during the strike period. MacFarlane called this a colossal mistake on the network's part and made clear that it was damaging to their relationship. The network's willingness to use his show without his involvement was not something he forgot. It was one more item in a long ledger of grievances between a liberal creator and a conservative-leaning corporate structure. By the time of the 2023 Writers Guild strike, MacFarlane and the Family Guy showrunners again departed the show in solidarity with striking writers. Fox's parent company at this point was functionally Disney, which had acquired 20th Century Fox's entertainment assets in 2019. The relationship was further complicated by the fact that MacFarlane's production company had by then been affiliated with NBC Universal for 3 years. He was technically producing a show for a Disney-owned network through a deal with a Comcast-owned studio. The contractual and corporate architecture was labyrinthine enough that the simple fact of his continued involvement with Family Guy had become almost a historical artifact, a holdover from an earlier era of his career that stubbornly remained on the schedule. In April 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 additional seasons in what was described as a mega deal with Disney. The show would run through the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with its 30th anniversary. Each season would consist of 15 episodes. The creator, who had said in 2024 that he had considered ending the show and decided against it, would now see his creation continue for at least 4 more years beyond that conversation. Whether he views that as good news or complicated news is a question that his very carefully worded public statements have never quite answered. The truth of the McFarlane departure is not a scandal, and it is not a betrayal. It is something more ordinary and in some ways more melancholy than either of those things. A man made something remarkable when he was young. It grew beyond him. It became an institution with its own momentum, its own corporate obligations, its own team of people whose livelihoods depended on it continuing. And at a certain point, the man who had made it had more important things to him, personally and creatively, calling for his time and attention. He moved toward those things. The show moved on without him. And the gap between the show with him and the show without him was visible in the work, even if nobody in any official capacity was ever quite willing to say so directly. Section 8. The South Park War. The feud. Nobody was supposed to talk about the rivalry between Family Guy and South Park as one of those situations in popular culture where the surface story, the mutual mockery, and the public spats is interesting enough on its own, but the deeper story, the industry dynamics that the feud revealed, and the cultural arguments it was actually staging is significantly more interesting. This was not just two animated shows trading insults. This was a philosophical disagreement about what comedy was supposed to be and what it owed its audience, played out in the most public arena possible, with real professional and personal stakes for the people involved. South Park debuted in 1997, 2 years before Family Guy. Trey Parker and Matt Stone created it on Comedy Central, and from its very first season, it established itself as something genuinely different from what else was on television. South Park was satirical in the classical sense, meaning it used comedy to make specific arguments about specific targets in the real world. Every episode was written and produced in the week before it aired, which gave it an immediacy that no other animated show could match. It commented on things that were actually happening right now, and because of that speed, its commentary felt urgent and pointed in a way that more conventionally scheduled shows could never achieve. Family Guy was doing something different. Family Guy was doing something that its creator and its audience love, and that Parker and Stone, after watching it carefully, decided they genuinely hated. Family Guy's comedy was built on reference, association, and the cutaway gag. A character would say something that reminded them of another thing, the show would jump to a brief dramatization of that other thing, and the audience would laugh at the recognition or the absurdity of the transition. The jokes did not need to advance the plot. They did not need to develop the characters. They were self-contained moments designed to produce a specific emotional response. A laugh, a groan, a surprised bark of recognition. And then they were over, and the show moved on. Parker and Stone watched this and saw it as a form of comedy that required no skill. Their position, expressed privately and then very publicly, was that the Family Guy writers were smart enough to write a better show and were choosing not to, opting instead for the easy laugh of the cutaway reference because it was more efficient than doing the harder work of building jokes that emerged organically from character and situation. They were not saying Family Guy was not funny. Some of the cutaways were objectively funny. They were saying that the form of comedy Family Guy had committed to was fundamentally lazy in a way that they found disrespectful to the craft. In April 2006, they staged their argument on television. South Park aired a 2-part episode called Cartoon Wars. The nominal subject was a controversy about whether an episode of the fictional Family Guy would be allowed to depict the Prophet Muhammad, an obviously pointed reference to the real controversy about Danish newspaper cartoons of Muhammad that had recently sparked international protests. But the Muhammad controversy was, as Parker and Stone later admitted, a vehicle. The real target was Family Guy's writing methodology. In the episode, Eric Cartman goes to the Family Guy studios and discovers that the show is not written by human beings at all. It is written by manatees. Large, gentle, dim sea mammals who live in a tank full of floating balls, each ball printed with a word or concept. The manatees push a small number of balls into a slot, and the balls that come out determine the joke for the week. That is how Family Guy jokes are made. Not by writers thinking carefully about character and consequence and comic timing. By random chance. by the equivalent of pulling words from a bag and seeing what happens when you combine them. The joke was savage, and it was not entirely fair because the early Family Guy cutaways were not actually random. They were carefully constructed to create specific effects. But it was also not entirely unfair, because by 2006, the show had already started leaning on the cutaway format in ways that were getting less purposeful and more scattershot. Parker and Stone were criticizing a direction the show was heading, more than the show as it had been. But that distinction mattered less than the underlying critique, which resonated with anyone who had been watching the show's evolution. What happened after the episode aired was remarkable. Parker and Stone received communication from the writing staffs of The Simpsons and King of the Hill. The Simpsons people reportedly sent flowers. The King of the Hill people reportedly called to say, in Parker's later paraphrase, that they were doing God's work. Parker described the moment as a kind of animation solidarity event, where everyone in the industry who had been watching Family Guy's methods with unease had suddenly found a public statement of what they had been privately thinking. The broader animation community, or at least significant parts of it, had been frustrated with Family Guy for years. They just had not been willing to say it on television. McFarlane's response was complicated. In a 2012 interview with Rolling Stone, he said he thought the South Park episode making fun of Family Guy was funny and accurate. That last word is worth sitting with. Accurate. McFarlane is a smart person. He knew that the manatee joke was not entirely off base. He found it funny because it was pointed at something real. What he said he did not understand was the personal venom that Parker and Stone expressed in press appearances that were not jokes, the things they said in interviews and public forums where they were clearly speaking seriously rather than satirically. He said he did not understand where that personal dimension of the hostility came from. Parker and Stone made their position clear in the DVD commentary for Cartoon Wars. They said they had seen Family Guy and they genuinely hated it. Not as a joke, not as a competitive posture. They hated it. They did not think Family Guy should be taken off the air. They did not think it was not entertaining. They just did not respect it in terms of writing. Parker specifically said that they could always identify writers on their own staff who came from a comedy tradition that inclined toward gags, toward random funny things that were funny in isolation, and that one of the ongoing challenges of the South Park writing process was training people out of that tendency because it was the easy path and therefore the wrong one. The Family Guy writers were aware of all of this and dealt with it in the way the show dealt with most things, with a mixture of defensive humor and barely concealed resentment. In their DVD commentaries for episodes that came out around the same period, writers began referring to their own cutaway gags as manatee jokes, adopting the Parker and Stone terminology as a kind of ironic self-description. It was a clever move. By naming the thing yourself, you deflate its power as an external criticism. But it also reveals that the criticism landed. You do not adopt your critic's vocabulary unless the vocabulary fits. McFarlane considered a more direct response. He later mentioned that a specific joke was developed for a Season 6 episode, one that would have involved Parker and Stone in a compromising scenario that would have served as the show's formal counterstrike. He decided against it. His stated reason was that it would have been in bad taste. A less charitable reading is that it would have escalated a conflict that was already damaging the show's reputation in ways he preferred to contain. The irony of the whole situation is that both shows kept going. South Park is still running. Family Guy is still running. The philosophical argument Parker and Stone made in Cartoon Wars turned out to be correct in its description of where Family Guy was heading, even if its characterization of the early show was reductive. Family Guy did become progressively more dependent on the cutaway format in exactly the way they warned it would. The manatees were right. And then, in a twist that nobody saw coming, McFarlane's most recent creative work, specifically a sequence involving deepfake technology in a project connected to his production company, ended up being produced by Deep Voodoo, the visual effects studio founded by Parker and Stone. The men who had publicly feuded for nearly 2 decades ended up in a business relationship, quietly, without announcement, without the press statement that might have made it a news story. Whatever the South Park War was for them personally, it had apparently not closed every possible professional door between them. Section 9. The Fox Network Power Struggle. The Battle Behind the Screen. The relationship between Family Guy and Fox Broadcasting is one of the strangest and most layered creator-network dynamics in American television history. On the surface, it looks like a standard arrangement. A network owns a show, the show makes money, everyone is happy. But underneath that surface, from almost the very beginning of the show's run, there was a tension that shaped what the show could be, what it was allowed to say, what battles its creator chose to fight, and which ones he quietly conceded. Understanding that tension explains more about Family Guy's evolution than any simple narrative about creative decline. Fox Broadcasting Company exists within a corporate structure that also houses Fox News. This matters because Seth MacFarlane is politically and socially liberal in ways that he has never been shy about expressing. He has been open about his atheism, his support for causes related to environmental conservation and LGBTQ rights, his opposition to specific political figures and positions that have been associated with Fox News throughout its history. The network that carried his show and the news organization that shared that network's name were frequently at philosophical odds with the man who was making one of their most profitable properties. MacFarlane navigated this for years with a mixture of satirical jabs embedded in the show itself and careful public statements that stayed just inside the lines of what a network talent could say without creating a contractual problem. Family Guy was always willing to mock Fox News explicitly. The show made jokes at the expense of the network's personalities and positions regularly, sometimes with a specificity that made it clear the writers were watching carefully and storing grievances. In a sense, the show was conducting a long-running argument with its host network, and the host network was accepting the argument because the show generated too much revenue to cancel over political disagreements. The 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike brought the underlying tension into the open in a new way. MacFarlane was a strong and visible supporter of the striking writers. He was seen on the picket lines. He refused to complete work on Family Guy episodes after the strike began. Fox, facing a November sweeps period and a schedule gap, exercised their contractual right to finish and air episodes without MacFarlane's final creative approval. They aired 2 new episodes in November 2007 in this manner. MacFarlane's response in Variety was direct and raw. He called what Fox had done a colossal mistake on their part and said it was going to be unfortunate and damaging to their relationship. He acknowledged that Fox had the legal right to do what they did. He was not disputing the contract. He was expressing what it felt like from the creator's side to have his show aired over his explicit objection during a labor dispute that he was personally invested in on ethical grounds. The line between having a legal right to do something and doing it in a way that does not permanently damage a professional relationship was one Fox crossed that November, and the damage was real, even if no one in an official capacity ever fully acknowledged it. The relationship continued in its strained way for years after. MacFarlane expressed frustration in 2018 when Fox News host Tucker Carlson told viewers to ignore mainstream news sources, tweeting his agreement with a critique of Carlson's position and noting that it was the kind of business practice that made him embarrassed to work for the same corporation. In April 2020, after a different Fox News host made comments, MacFarlane found objectionable. He tweeted that he genuinely could not understand how he and this person could be producing content for the same corporation. These were not isolated remarks. They were part of a consistent pattern of MacFarlane using his public platform to express the discomfort he could not express through his contractual channels. The 2021 tweet about Tucker Carlson represented a qualitative escalation. MacFarlane did not just express displeasure with a specific Fox News position. He explicitly called his relationship with Fox a failing marriage and identified his growing relationship with NBC Universal as an affair. The metaphor was deliberately domestic and deliberately dramatic. He was not being subtle about what he thought about his situation. A creator does not use language like this unless they have made peace with the idea that the relationship they are describing has a limited future. The question of whether Family Guy could ever actually leave Fox is complicated by the corporate architecture. The show is produced by 20th Century Fox Television, which after the Disney acquisition became part of the Disney corporate family. Fox Broadcasting Company, which airs the show, is a separate entity under the Fox Corporation umbrella. MacFarlane's production deal had shifted to NBC Universal, but the show itself was contractually embedded in a structure that could not simply be picked up and moved because its creator was unhappy. The content was Fox's property. MacFarlane was the creator. These were different things, and the differences had significant financial and legal implications. What MacFarlane could do, and eventually did, was redirect his new creative energy elsewhere. The Orville went to Hulu when it moved off Fox. American Dad had long since moved to TBS. His new development projects were all being built at NBC Universal Properties. Family Guy remained on Fox not because MacFarlane wanted it there or was enthusiastic about the association, but because the contractual and commercial structure made any alternative prohibitively complex. The show was running on inertia and money and the weight of 25 years of institutional infrastructure. The 2025 renewal, the so-called mega deal that extended the show through season 27, represents the culmination of this dynamic. Disney, as the parent of 20th Century Fox Television, negotiated a deal that guarantees the show will continue producing new episodes through 2029. MacFarlane, despite his public expressions of wanting the show elsewhere, will continue voicing its characters. The machine keeps running because the machine is profitable and because profitability, at a certain scale and duration, creates its own inertia that individual preferences cannot easily override. The power struggle between MacFarlane and Fox was never going to end in a clean victory for either side. Networks do not surrender profitable content because creators are unhappy. Creators do not walk away from intellectual property they cannot fully control. What the struggle produced instead was a long, slow negotiation played out across press statements and social media posts and inside jokes embedded in the episodes themselves, with neither party willing to make the final move that would force a resolution. The show that results from this dynamic is a show that exists in a kind of perpetual tension, its creator at a distance from it, its network ambivalent about its politics, its audience watching something made by people whose full enthusiasm for the project diminished years ago but whose professional obligations kept them in the room. Section 10. The lost episodes, cutscenes, and deleted storylines. Nobody knows about there's a version of Family Guy that never made it to any screen. Not the broadcast version, not the DVD version, not the streaming version. A version that exists in writing room notebooks and script drafts and recording session outtakes and animation test reels and the memories of the people who were in the building when it was made. Television production is wasteful in a specific way. The ratio of material created to material released is enormous, and most of what gets cut or abandoned or never greenlit gets cut for reasons that have nothing to do with quality. They get cut because of time or money or network politics or fear, or simply because the show has to end somewhere and the decisions about what ends up outside the cut are often arbitrary. Family Guy, with its long run and its famously high joke density per episode, has been particularly prolific in generating material that never reached the audience. The DVD releases of various seasons have included deleted scenes, alternate takes, and extended versions of episodes that reveal how different some episodes could have been in their final form. The uncut version of the episode P.T. Phi, which was produced as a satire of broadcast censorship, included a scene in which Peter engages in dangerous behavior above a highway overpass that was cut entirely from the broadcast version before a single viewer had seen it. This was not a last-minute decision made for time. The scene was produced. It was animated. It cost money to make. And then it was removed because the network decided it went too far. The episode The Splendid Source, mentioned earlier, represents a particularly interesting case because the content that was removed, the punchline of the joke the episode had been building toward, was the functional core of the episode's premise. The entire episode is about searching for the origin of a specific crude joke. The joke itself, in its complete form, exists in the production materials. It never aired. Viewers who watched the broadcast version sat through 22 minutes of setup for a punchline they never received. The DVD version corrects this, but the broadcast experience of that episode was structurally broken by the censorship decision in a way that I suspect the writers found deeply frustrating. Beyond individual scenes, there are storylines and character arcs that were developed to varying degrees and then abandoned. MacFarlane confirmed in a Playboy interview that a complete script was written for an episode in which Stewie comes out as gay. The episode reached what he described as the script phase, meaning it had been developed far enough that a full draft existed, dialogue written, story beats established. The episode was ultimately shelved in favor of keeping Stewie's sexuality permanently ambiguous. That script is somewhere. It was read by the writers who worked on it. It was discussed in rooms. It represented a direction the show consciously chose not to take. And the fact that it was written at all says something about what the show was willing to imagine, even when it was not willing to commit. There are other ghost episodes in the show's history. The canceled original episode called Queer as Stewie, which was in development during the show's first run before the initial cancellation, was apparently a more explicit treatment of Stewie's sexuality than anything that was later produced. The cancellation in 2002 interrupted whatever development that episode was going through, and when the show returned, it was reworked into a different episode involving Stewie meeting his future self rather than coming out. The original concept, whatever it contained, did not survive the revival. The audio outtakes from the recording sessions for Family Guy, which exist in the archive materials of the show, reportedly contain performances that are significantly different from, and often funnier than what made it into episodes. Voice actors in animated shows often improvise in the booth, and Seth MacFarlane specifically has described sessions where extended improvisational riffs would happen in character, with the voice cast building on each other's energy in ways that were not always captured in the final edited version of an episode. The dynamic between MacFarlane's Peter and Brian in the recording booth apparently produced material that the writers would sometimes use as raw material for future scripts. And some of the best character work from the early seasons reportedly grew directly from these unscripted session moments. The Star Wars parody trilogy that Family Guy produced between 2007 and 2010, The Blue Harvest, Something 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 Dark Side, and It's a Trap episodes, contains production materials indicating that several extended sequences and alternate jokes were developed and animated before being cut for length and pacing. The extended versions that appeared on DVD are themselves not complete production cuts. There are extended sequences involving specific characters and parody moments that exist in the production archive but were never released in any format. Perhaps the most significant category of Lost Family Guy content is the alternate endings and alternate outcomes for major plot developments. The show's writer room, like all television writing rooms, generates multiple options for how stories can resolve, and the choices made in the final version are not always the choices that were made first or the ones that were considered best by everyone in the room. The Brian death storyline, for example, almost certainly generated multiple proposals for how long the death would last, whether the revival would happen through time travel or some other mechanism, and what the emotional aftermath of the revival would look like for the characters. We got one version. Others were written and discussed. The extended universe of Family Guy content that exists outside the main series also contains material that most fans have never engaged with. The Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story DVD special, released in 2005, was assembled from 3 episodes that had been produced for the series, but packaged together as a standalone film release. The DVD version of this material contains scenes and content that were not included in any broadcast version and that were cut differently from the version most people saw. The commentary tracks on various season DVD sets contain references to jokes and story ideas that were developed but not used, with the writers sometimes describing them in enough detail to get a clear sense of what they would have been. All of this lost material is, in a sense, a shadow version of Family Guy running parallel to the official one. Every choice made is a choice between the version that happened and the versions that were considered. The show that audiences watched was always one among several possible shows that could have been made from the same raw materials, the same characters, the same world, the same basic sensibility. The lost episodes and cut scenes are windows into the possibilities that were closed off, deliberately or accidentally, by the decisions made in editing rooms and network offices and writing sessions at odd hours. Section 11. The Cleveland Spin-off Conspiracy. Why the most obvious choice was actually the wrong one. When Fox decided that Family Guy's success deserved a spin-off in 2009, the decision of which character would anchor the new show was both predictable and, in retrospect, revealing. Cleveland Brown, Peter Griffin's quiet, measured neighbor and longtime friend, was chosen to star in his own series. He left the Griffin family's neighborhood and moved back to his hometown of Steuben, Bend, Virginia, where he married his high school sweetheart, inherited a new family, and spent 4 seasons navigating life in a new community with his old sensibility. The Cleveland show ran from September 2009 to May 2013, and then it was canceled due to declining ratings, and Cleveland and his new family returned to the Griffin household's orbit in a season 12 episode that handled his return with mixed feelings on all sides. The conspiracy in the Cleveland spin-off story is not about any single dramatic decision or hidden agenda. It is about a series of assumptions that turned out to be wrong, and about the way those assumptions were never fully interrogated in public by the people who should have been interrogating them. The first assumption was that Cleveland Brown was the right character for a spinoff. This was the obvious choice in a certain sense because Cleveland was a soft-spoken, affable, reasonable presence in the main cast who did not already have a spin-off defining personality quirk that would overwhelm a standalone show. He was nice. He was relatable. He had a voice that was distinct without being cartoonish. Mike Henry, who voiced him, was a talented performer with genuine comedic instincts. On paper, Cleveland seemed like a character with enough room to grow into a larger role. But the question that was apparently not asked with sufficient seriousness was, what is it about Cleveland Brown specifically that an audience would want to spend half an hour with every week? His appeal in Family Guy was largely relational. He worked because of his dynamic with Peter and Joe and Quagmire. He was the calm center of a group that generated chaos around him. Separate him from that group, relocate him to a new city with new characters, and the specific quality that made him work in the original context disappeared. The show tried to compensate by surrounding him with a new ensemble that included an actual bear as one of his neighbors, a character named Tim, who was a talking bear and one of the more surreal additions to any network animated comedy. But the ensemble never quite cohered into something with the same chemistry as the original. The more interesting question, and the one that was debated at the time but never received a satisfying public answer, was, why Cleveland and not Quagmire? Glenn Quagmire was in many ways the more dramatically interesting character. He had a more complex psychology than Cleveland. His hypersexuality, which on the surface looked like a single comic trait, was actually the surface expression of something deeply damaged about the character. A man who was unable to form genuine connections, and whose relentless pursuit of sexual encounters was a symptom of profound emotional isolation. The show touched on this occasionally and to good effect, with some of the later Quagmire episodes being among the more emotionally complex work the show did. A show built around Quagmire, exploring that psychology with the freedom of a standalone series, had the potential to be genuinely unusual and interesting. The answer reportedly given in various behind-the-scenes conversations was that Quagmire was too defined by a single characteristic to anchor a show, and that his particular characteristic was too dependent on shock value to sustain long-form storytelling. There was also a question, apparently raised in development discussions, about whether Quagmire was someone audiences would want to follow over the long term, given that his behavior toward women, which was central to his character, would become harder to play sympathetically the more screen time it received. These are legitimate concerns, but they also suggest that the development process did not seriously entertain the idea of actually doing the harder creative work of finding out who Quagmire was underneath his most obvious surface trait. Joe Swanson was the other candidate who got discussed. Joe had qualities that could have supported a spin-off in theory. He was a cop. His disability provided a backdrop for interesting material about identity and capability, and how society treats people with physical limitations, and Patrick Warburton's voice was one of the most distinctive and beloved elements of the entire Family Guy cast. The reported reason Joe was not chosen was that his character was too weird, which in context seems to mean too specific and too unlikely to appeal to a broad enough audience in a standalone format. This may be right. It is also possible that Joe's disability, if placed at the center of a show rather than the periphery, would have required a kind of thoughtful and careful writing about disability that the Family Guy production culture was not particularly equipped to provide. The Cleveland show's failure was a slow, quiet one. It never generated the cultural heat of Family Guy. It was never particularly beloved or particularly despised. It occupied a space in the Sunday night animation domination lineup, attracted reasonable if declining numbers, and then was canceled without much ceremony. Critical reception ranged from mixed to lukewarm. The show had its moments, episodes that were genuinely funny and characters that worked, but it never found the specific identity that would have made it feel necessary rather than supplementary. The most lasting consequence of the Cleveland show's failure was its effect on the character of Cleveland Brown himself. When he returned to the main Family Guy cast, Mike Henry continued voicing him for several more seasons before stepping down from the role in 2020, saying publicly that he felt it was no longer appropriate for a white actor to voice a black animated character. The decision was part of a broader industry reconsideration of voice casting practices, and Henry made it voluntarily. YouTube creator Arif Zahir has voiced Cleveland since then. The spin-off Conspiracy, in the end, is less a story about hidden decisions and more a story about the predictability of television development culture, which tends to look at what has worked and attempt to replicate its most obvious surface elements, rather than examine what made those elements work in the first place. Cleveland was chosen because he was nice and available, and his voice performer was a known quantity, and his character did not present any obvious obstacles to a broader audience. Nobody at any point in the development process seems to have seriously asked the harder question, which was whether any of those qualities were actually the qualities that made a character interesting enough to follow into a new world for years. The show existed, it was canceled, and the lesson it offered about the limits of franchise logic in animation was never quite drawn explicitly by the people who would have benefited most from drawing it. Section 12. The hidden symbolism and Easter eggs nobody noticed. The version of Family Guy that most viewers encountered across its many seasons was a loud, fast-paced comedy that seemed to value the speed of its jokes over the subtlety of its construction. The cutaways came quickly, the references piled on top of each other, and the overall experience was one of volume and velocity rather than careful, contemplative design. But underneath that surface energy, the show contained a significant amount of material that rewarded close attention, blink and you miss it details that pointed outward to other things, and self-referential jokes so well disguised that they required either sharp eyes or the pause button to appreciate fully. The Stewie blocks sequence is one of the most famous examples. In an early episode, there is a quick shot of Stewie sitting on the floor of his room, playing with building blocks. If you pause the image and look at what he has built, the blocks spell out the word Red Rum, the backwards spelling of murder from Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining. The reference is pitch perfect not just as a pop culture callback, but as a character note. In The Shining, the child who writes Red Rum is psychically connected to something dark and violent that the adults around him cannot fully perceive. The parallel to Stewie, an infant sitting in a crib surrounded by adults who have no idea how dangerous he is, could not be more exact. The joke is good enough to work as a quick visual gag. It is also a piece of genuine characterization disguised as a throwaway detail. The sheet music visible above Lois's piano in the opening credits of the show is, upon close examination, the actual notated sheet music for the Family Guy theme song itself. This is the kind of detail that requires not just good eyesight, but the willingness to pause and actually read musical notation in a brief animated sequence. The animators knew virtually nobody would catch it. They put it there anyway. This is the kind of insider communication that exists in a production culture where the people making the show are also entertaining themselves, leaving signals for the rare viewers sharp enough to receive them. Several pieces of background text hidden in newspaper headlines and signs throughout the show's run were written specifically to reward pause and read viewing. An episode called Model Misbehavior features the Griffin family winning a boat race and having their photo in the newspaper. If you look carefully at the newspaper page in the shot, below the visible headline there is another headline that reads, "In full, DVDs paused for headline joke, millions disappointed." This is the show's production team making a joke that can only be appreciated if you do the specific thing it is making a joke about. The self-referential humor loops back on itself in a way that is quietly elegant. In one episode, while Peter is flipping through a TV guide, there is a small message visible under an actor's photograph that reads, "If you can read this, Family Guy is on the air." The message is clearly directed at fans who would pause and examine the image closely, and it is also a small piece of institutional humor about the show's precarious broadcast history. The show was canceled twice. The fact that anyone could read that message at all was the result of a survival story. The message knows this about itself. The show made extensive use of self-referential cross-references between Family Guy and other Seth MacFarlane properties. In several episodes, there are brief appearances by characters or design elements from American Dad and Family Guy's background, and vice versa, creating a shared universe that was never made explicit in any dramatic way, but was visible to careful viewers over many years of watching. The Stan Smith crossover in the Simpsons Guy episode played with this directly, but the background connections predated that crossover by many seasons. The Gumble to Gumble reference is a particularly well-constructed piece of insider humor. In one episode, Peter is given the opportunity to bring back any canceled television show he chooses, and he selects a show called Gumble to Gumble. This is not a real show. It is, however, the name of the very first project that MacFarlane pitched to Fox before Family Guy existed. The pitch did not get picked up. It lives in the Family Guy universe as an obscure in-joke that only someone with detailed knowledge of MacFarlane's professional history would recognize. The show was commemorating a rejection in the most discreet and ironic way possible. The connections between Family Guy and The Simpsons were frequent and layered, ranging from obvious jokes about the rivalry between the two shows to more subtle structural echoes that suggested the Family Guy writers were engaged in a continuous, mostly silent conversation with the older show. When the two shows finally crossed over in 2014 in the episode The Simpsons Guy, the fight between Homer and Peter was explicitly framed as a version of Peter's recurring battles with the giant chicken, and it included Homer throwing Emmy Awards at Peter, noting that Peter had none to throw back. The self-deprecating reference to the show's award history was delivered in a context that made it feel both genuinely funny and quietly rueful. The show also made repeated use of what could be called structural Easter eggs, formal choices in how episodes were constructed that commented on the show's own methods. The Back to the Pilot episode, in which Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the first episode of the show, included a scene where they observe the characters of that first episode standing around awkwardly during a cutaway, with nothing to do but wait for it to end. The joke acknowledges the formal problem with the cutaway structure, namely that the regular narrative completely stops during them, in a way that makes that problem the source of comedy. The show is laughing at its own limitations while simultaneously indulging them. That is a specific kind of self-awareness, one that sees the problem clearly and decides to work with it rather than solve it. The production history of the show is itself embedded in the episodes in ways that most viewers never noticed. The animation style changed significantly multiple times across the show's run, and some of those changes were specifically commented on by the writers in background details that only animation history enthusiasts would catch. The shift from hand-drawn-looking animation in the first 3 seasons to the cleaner digital style of the later seasons is visible not just in the final product, but in small contextual jokes that appeared in episodes made during transition periods. References to things looking different or feeling off that were read by general audiences as random comedy, but were actually the writers acknowledging in real time that the visual identity of the show was shifting under their feet. The show's relationship with its own merchandise was also treated with a specific kind of self-aware irony. An episode featuring a yard sale includes a shot of Brian's table with a DVD copy of Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, for sale. The DVD version of this scene extends it to include Lois criticizing the special for presenting itself as a movie when it was really 3 episodes edited together. The show was simultaneously selling its own merchandise and mocking the commercial calculation behind that merchandise, a trick that only works if you are confident enough in your audience's intelligence to let them in on the joke. There are deeper patterns too, thematic echoes that run across seasons, and suggest that even as the show's quality was uneven, there were writers in the room who were thinking carefully about what the show was doing over time. The recurring motif of characters discovering uncomfortable truths about their own limitations and then being unable to act on that knowledge because the show's structure would not allow genuine change, this is a pattern that appears in episodes about Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Meg at different points in the show's history. It may not have been consciously designed as a through line, but it reflects something true about the show's predicament, the awareness of decline that kept surfacing in individual episodes, but could never accumulate into actual transformation, because the reset button was always waiting at the end of the hour. The Easter eggs and hidden details in Family Guy are not just a collection of fun trivia. They are evidence of a specific creative culture, one where the people making the show were engaged with it on multiple levels simultaneously, where the official product and the meta-commentary on the official product existed in the same frame, and where the relationship between the show and its audience was understood to include both the casual viewer and the obsessive one. The show respected the people who paid close attention. It left things for them to find. And in doing so, it created a second layer of meaning that ran underneath everything else, quieter and more thoughtful than the loud comedy above it, and in many ways more interesting. Section 13. The voice behind the curtain. Seth MacFarlane's real relationship with his characters. There is a question that gets asked occasionally about Seth MacFarlane and Family Guy that sounds simple but gets complicated the moment you start pulling on it. The question is, which of the characters does he actually identify with? Which of these people, built from his imagination and his experience and his sense of humor, is the one that feels most like a version of himself? The answer changes depending on which era of the show you are looking at and which MacFarlane interview you happen to be reading. But the most honest and complete answer is that he has something of himself in all of them, and that understanding which qualities went where explains more about the show than most analytical frameworks can. The most obvious connection most people make is between MacFarlane and Brian. Brian is the cultured, literary, politically liberal, slightly arrogant member of the household. He drinks, he has opinions, he went to a good school and never fully got over it. He wanted to be a writer. He has strongly held views that he is sometimes better at expressing than living by. If you know anything about MacFarlane's public persona, the overlap is clear. He graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design. He has been vocal about his political beliefs throughout his career. He has made television, films, music albums, and public speeches. He is, by anyone's measure, a person who takes culture seriously and who has a certain self-image connected to that seriousness. Brian was, in the early seasons especially, a version of the aspirational self, the dog who was reading the right books and going to the right parties and maintaining the right opinions even when Peter was providing a constant reminder that most of the world operates at a different altitude. What is interesting about the later Brian is what it says about MacFarlane's own self-awareness. Brian became arrogant, pretentious, hypocritical, inconsistent, and ultimately something of a cautionary figure. The writers, including MacFarlane in the years he was still in the room, allowed Brian to become the worst version of the qualities that made him appealing in the first season. The literary dog became the dog who could not finish a book. The intellectual became the intellectual fraud. The romantic became the shallow womanizer. Whether this was an intentional act of self-criticism or simply the natural consequence of writers pushing a character to extremes over many seasons is something that nobody involved with the show has ever addressed directly. But the character MacFarlane has talked most openly about in terms of personal connection is Stewie. Not the later Stewie, not the emotionally vulnerable companion figure, but the original one. The evil genius baby with the British accent and the world domination plots. MacFarlane has described Stewie as his favorite character to perform, the one that comes most naturally, the one that feels most fully inhabited when he steps into the recording booth. In interviews, he has described the voice as something that emerged from a love of Rex Harrison, the British actor famous for his precise, slightly imperious diction, and from a broader appreciation for the kind of English language performance that prioritizes articulation and timing over emotional expressiveness. There is something revealing about a young American creator identifying most strongly with a character defined by his voice, his inability to be understood by most of the people around him, his ambitions that exceed his circumstances in every conceivable way, and his deep, complicated relationship with his family. MacFarlane, at 24, was a person with very large ambitions in an industry that had no reason yet to take him seriously. He was performing a version of competence and sophistication in pitch meetings and development conversations, doing the voices himself, presenting a complete creative vision to people who could dismiss him in an afternoon. The baby who spoke like a British aristocrat while nobody in his family could understand what he was saying is not a difficult metaphor to unpack. Peter Griffin is the character MacFarlane performs every episode but discusses the least in terms of personal connection, which is itself interesting. Peter is the loudest, most visible character in the show, and also the one whose qualities are least flattering, least aspirational, and most clearly designed to represent everything that early Family Guy was satirizing about American working-class masculinity. He is stupid, but lovable. He is impulsive, but big-hearted. He makes things worse, but he means well. This was the character description in seasons 1 through 3. The later seasons stripped out the lovable and the big-hearted and left the stupid and the impulsive and added cruel and uncaring to the mix. The transformation of Peter from the version McFarlane was making fun of affectionately to the version later writers were making fun of coldly tracks fairly precisely with how involved McFarlane himself was in making those decisions. The Peter he was responsible for creating was a character with genuine warmth. The Peter he stopped overseeing became something else. Brian, Stewie, and Peter together are like an externalized portrait of McFarlane's different selves. The pretentious intellectual he wanted to be, the ambitious genius who felt unrecognized, and the lovable fool that popular comedy required him to put at the center of his show. Lois is in some ways the most interesting character in this reading, because she represents the practical, managing intelligence that had to contain and redirect all of those other energies. McFarlane has spoken warmly about Lois in interviews, describing her as one of the show's most underappreciated characters, the one who held the whole structure together without getting enough credit for doing it. In the early seasons, this reading holds up. Lois was genuinely competent and genuinely generous and genuinely capable of the kind of emotional labor that kept a chaotic family functional. The voice performances McFarlane gives are themselves a hidden layer of the show's meaning. When he performs Peter, he uses a voice that is broad and physically anchored, a kind of New England blue-collar affect that grounds the character in a specific regional and class identity. When he performs Brian, the voice is measured and slightly self-conscious, intellectually careful in a way that can tip over into affected. When he performs Stewie, there is a precision and a delight in the precision that you can hear in every line reading, a performer genuinely enjoying the very specific pleasure of being that character in that moment. And when he performs Quagmire, there is an almost theatrical villainy that McFarlane leans into with what sounds like significant personal enjoyment. The relationship between performer and character in animation is different from live action in ways that are easy to understate. A live-action performer has a face, a body, a physical presence that exists independently of the role and that the audience relates to directly. An animated performer has only their voice, which means the relationship between performer and character is purely vocal and purely internal. What you hear in the recording of a good animated performance is the performer's actual emotional engagement, unmediated by any physical artifice. When McFarlane performs Stewie at his best, what you are hearing is a man who genuinely loves being that character, who finds genuine joy in the voice and the worldview and the specific pleasure of a baby saying something murderous in perfect RP diction. That joy is audible. It is part of why the character works. In the later seasons, when McFarlane was no longer in the writing room and was coming to the show primarily as a voice actor, performing scripts he had not been involved in writing, the performances are technically excellent, but sometimes feel slightly less inhabited than the early work. This is speculation rather than documented fact, but performers typically do their best work with material they have helped shape, material that reflects their actual sensibility rather than material handed to them by someone else. The voice is the same, the character is the same on paper, but something subtle shifts when the person doing the performing is no longer the person making the decisions about what is worth saying. Understanding McFarlane's relationship with his characters helps explain why some of the show's stranger decisions, like Brian's death, were received by the creator with the specific kind of detached amusement that his public statement suggested. He was surprised by the fan reaction because he was, at that point, primarily a performer rather than a creative decision-maker. He had not been in the room when the death was planned. He was informed of the plan, agreed to record the episodes, and then observed the fan reaction from a slight distance, with the equanimity of someone who is watching something happen to a character rather than something he had authored himself. His amusement at the outrage was the amusement of a man who still cared about Brian Griffin but no longer felt the same sense of personal ownership over him that he had felt in the years when every Brian story was shaped by his own sensibility. The voice behind the curtain is still there. McFarlane still records every episode. His voice still gives Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire their specific presences. But the relationship between that voice and the content being voiced has changed in ways that are difficult to hear, but that longtime viewers can feel. The show sounds like what it used to be. It does not always feel like what it used to be. And the distance between those two things, between sound and feeling, is the distance between Seth MacFarlane, the voice actor, and Seth MacFarlane, the creator. A distance that opened up gradually and has never been closed. Section 14. The Writer's Room Secrets. How Family Guy's comedy was actually made. The production culture of a long-running animated comedy is one of the least discussed and most consequential forces shaping what that show becomes over time. The writer's room is where the show is really made, where the jokes are tested and argued over and refined or discarded, where the specific sensibility of the show is reproduced or evolved or slowly replaced with something else. For Family Guy, the history of the writer's room is inseparable from the history of the show's quality, its controversies, and its evolution. And most of that history has never been told to the audience. The original writing staff that MacFarlane assembled for the first 3 seasons included names that Family Guy fans have seen in credits but may not have thought about as a distinct creative community. Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, Mike Barker. These writers worked together to establish not just individual jokes, but the fundamental tone of the early show. The balance between darkness and warmth, between absurdism and character, between the cutaway gag and the episode structure that contained it. They built something together, and the thing they built had a coherence that came from shared sensibility developed in proximity over time. Writers' rooms are unusual creative environments. They are structured around a specific kind of social dynamics that does not exist in most other workplaces. The jokes have to be tested immediately, out loud, in front of a room full of people who are simultaneously your colleagues and your competitors. The response to a joke in the room, whether it gets a laugh or silence, directly determines whether it survives to the next draft. This creates a feedback loop that can produce brilliant material when the room has the right chemistry and terrible material when it does not. It also creates a culture where the most vocal and most confident voices tend to dominate, where a single strong personality can shift the direction of an entire room's output, and where the cumulative biases and blind spots of the group become baked into the show without anyone necessarily noticing. The post-cancellation writing rooms that reassembled around the revival in 2005 were different configurations of people. Some original writers came back. Others were new. The show that resulted was a different show, not just because of what was on the page, but because of who was in the room producing what was on the page. MacFarlane has acknowledged this directly in various interviews, noting that the constant disruption of the show's production schedule, the 2 cancellations, the 3-year hiatus, meant that the writing staff was always being rebuilt rather than allowed to develop the kind of deep institutional knowledge and chemistry that produces a show's best work. One of the less discussed aspects of the show's evolution is the increasing number of younger writers who came into the room over time and whose comedic references and sensibilities were shaped by a different generation's cultural education. The original writers had been shaped by television comedy of the 1970s and 1980s, by the specific rhythms and references of that era, by a comedy tradition that valued structure and subversion in a particular proportion. Writers who came into the room in the late 2000s and the 2010s had been shaped by internet culture, by the specific pleasures of the unexpected image macro and the out-of-context clip, by a comedy tradition that valued surprise and absurdism and emotional short circuits over narrative coherence. Both approaches produced funny material. They produced different kinds of funny material, and as the generational makeup of the room shifted, the show shifted with it in ways that were not always in the same direction as the early show's identity. The shift towards shock value in the later seasons is partly a generational story. The kind of humor that escalates graphic violence or transgresses social norms in increasingly extreme ways is a humor that developed specific cultural currency in the early internet era, when the attention economy was being established and the most extreme content was the most shareable content. Writers who came up in that environment brought those instincts into the room, and without a strong enough counterforce insisting on the different kind of comedy the early show had been built on, those instincts gradually became dominant in the material being produced. The Conway Twitty gag, which appears multiple times across several seasons, and involves the show simply broadcasting a complete Conway Twitty performance instead of a joke, is the most extreme and most famous example of a show running out of ideas and using the format of its most recognizable feature, the cutaway, to fill time with content that is explicitly not comedy. The first time it appeared, it generated a surprised laugh from many viewers precisely because of its complete refusal to deliver a punchline. That is a legitimate comic strategy, the anti-joke. The joke that is funny because of how thoroughly it declines to be a joke. But the anti-joke only works once or maybe twice before it becomes simply a non-joke, before the absence of comedy stops being subversive and starts being lazy. The Conway Twitty gag was used so many times that it moved definitively into the second category, and the fact that it was used that many times tells you something specific about what was happening in the writer's room during the period when it kept appearing. The room did not have enough material. Rather than making more material or making better material, someone decided that padding with a country music performance was acceptable. That decision got made and nobody with enough authority stopped it. The show's own self-awareness about its weaknesses, which showed up periodically in meta-jokes and fourth-wall-breaking moments, was both a strength and a symptom. It was a strength because it demonstrated that at least some of the people making the show knew it was not as good as it used to be and were capable of articulating why. It was a symptom because consistently knowing what is wrong with your show and continuing to do it anyway is a specific kind of failure, one that is somehow more dispiriting than simply not knowing. The joke in the Back to the Pilot episode about characters standing around awkwardly during cutaways with nothing to do until the gag is over is genuinely funny and also a precise description of what had gone wrong with the show's structure. Making that joke did not fix the structural problem. It just made the structural problem funnier for one episode and then moved on. The writing room also had a complicated relationship with the female characters on the show that became more complicated over time. In a room that was, for much of the show's run, predominantly male, the female characters tended to be written in ways that reflected the room's blind spots. Lois went from a nuanced, capable character in the early seasons to a more reactive presence, defined primarily by her relationship to Peter's chaos rather than by her own inner life. Meg, as has been discussed at length, became a target rather than a person. The improvement in both characters' treatment that occurred around seasons 14 and 15 tracked with changes in the room's demographics, with more women writers contributing to the show's direction. This is not a controversial point in discussions of television production culture. Diverse rooms produce more fully realized characters because more perspectives are represented in the conversation about who those characters are and what they deserve. The guest voice casting choices across the show's many seasons also contained their own hidden history. Family Guy attracted an extraordinary range of guest performers over the years, from major film and television stars to musicians, to politicians, to real-world versions of characters the show was parodying. The backstories behind some of these castings were more interesting than the episodes themselves. The decision to cast specific people sometimes reflected the show's relationships with those individuals. Sometimes reflected MacFarlane's personal admiration for a performer, and sometimes reflected the show's awareness of the satirical value of having a specific person appear in a specific context. The show's music, which was always one of its most genuinely accomplished elements, has a production history that most fans know nothing about. Walter Murphy, who composed the show's orchestral score, was a genuine virtuoso with a background in mainstream pop production who brought an unusual level of sophistication to what was essentially a network cartoon score. MacFarlane's genuine love of mid-century American popular music, the big band standards, and the Hollywood musical tradition meant that the show invested seriously in its musical sequences in a way that was unusual for an animated comedy. The musical episodes and musical sequences within regular episodes represent some of the show's most accomplished work, and they were produced with a seriousness of purpose that stood in sharp contrast to the more chaotic elements of the show's comedy. The hidden story of the writer's room is ultimately a story about what happens when a creative environment is built around a specific vision, and then that vision gradually becomes distributed among more and more people who each hold a piece of it, but none of whom hold the whole thing. The original writer's room had Seth MacFarlane in it. He was the center of gravity. He knew what the show was supposed to be, not because he had written it down in a document, but because he had carried it in his head from before the show existed. As the room changed and he stepped back, the center of gravity distributed itself among the remaining voices, and the show became a collective interpretation of what it used to be rather than a direct expression of what it was. That is a natural process. It happens to most long-running shows. But knowing it happened helps you understand why the show feels different in ways that are hard to articulate but instantly recognizable to anyone who watched from the beginning. Section 15. The Numbers Game. The Full Rating Story. Nobody tells completely. The ratings history of Family Guy is one of the most dramatic trajectories in the history of American network television. The full arc of it, from premiere to present, tells a story that is simultaneously a triumph of audience loyalty and a sobering record of what happens when a show runs for 3 times as long as it was designed to run. The numbers themselves are publicly available, but they are rarely presented in a way that makes the full scale of the decline visible. When you lay out the complete picture from that first episode watched by 22 million people to the later seasons watched by fewer people than live in many individual cities, the distance is almost vertiginous. The premiere on January 31st, 1999, pulling in 22 million viewers, needs the Super Bowl context to be properly understood, but it should not be dismissed on those grounds alone. A show that attracts 22 million viewers, even with the best possible lead-in audience, is demonstrating something. Not every show that follows the Super Bowl retains its audience for its entire runtime. People change channels. The remote control is right there. 22 million people watched Family Guy's first episode not just because they had been watching the game, but because the game ended and this thing came on, and they decided it was worth staying for. That says something real about the show's immediate appeal. The first season averaged 12.8 million households. That is a number that placed the show at roughly the 33rd most-watched program on American television in 1999, a more than respectable position for a debut animated comedy that was not The Simpsons. The show had established a genuine viewership in a very short time. Then Fox started moving it, and the numbers tell the story of what scheduling does to a show when the scheduling is hostile to its survival. Thursday nights against Frasier, Tuesday nights against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Both disastrous competitive environments for a young show building its audience. The numbers dropped not because the show got worse, but because the audience could not find it. The viewers who had been there in January 1999 were still out there. They just stopped tuning in because the show was in a different place every time they looked for it. The cancellation and revival created an unusual data gap in the show's history. There are no new viewership numbers for the period between 2002 and 2005 because there were no new episodes. What exists instead are the Adult Swim syndication numbers, which told a specific story about who was watching the show and when. The late-night Adult Swim audience was young, predominantly male, and watching at hours when traditional Nielsen measurement methods were less reliable. The show averaged around 1.9 million viewers per airing on Adult Swim, which sounds modest compared to the original Fox numbers, but represented an unusually loyal and commercially valuable demographic. This was not a mass audience. This was an audience that cared about the show specifically enough to watch it at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. When the show returned for Season 4 in May 2005, the premiere drew 11.85 million viewers. This was the show's best performance since the first season, a stunning demonstration that 3 years off the air had not depleted the audience's enthusiasm. The revival premium was real. People who had been following the Adult Swim reruns and buying the DVD sets showed up in enormous numbers to welcome the show back. By any measure, this was a success that Fox should have protected very carefully. Instead, the numbers began their long, slow decline. Season after season, the average viewership ticked downward. Not catastrophically, not in a way that would force an immediate decision, just consistently, season after season, a few 100,000 viewers at a time. Season 5 averaged around 8.1 million. Season 6 averaged around 7.6 million. These were still very good numbers for an animated comedy. The show was still one of Fox's strongest performers on Sunday nights. But the trajectory was established. The audience was shrinking, and it was not going to stop shrinking. The decline accelerated through the early teen seasons. Season 10, which is remembered partly for the Seahorse Seashell Party controversy, averaged around 7 million viewers. Season 13, which aired from 2014 to 2015, was down to around 5.86 million average viewers. In roughly a decade, the show had lost nearly 6 million viewers from its revival peak. That is an enormous loss by any measure. but it was still enough viewers for Fox to keep renewing the show because the show was cheap to produce and profitable in ways that raw viewership numbers do not fully capture. The real collapse came in the following years. Season 20 averaged just 1.31 million viewers with a 0.45 rating in the key adult demographic. This is the number that requires some processing. A show that had 11.85 million viewers at its revival peak had, roughly 15 years later, retained about 11% of that audience. Season 23 dropped further, to an average of around 723,000 viewers, less than three-quarters of a million people watching new episodes of one of the most culturally recognizable animated shows in American television history. The show that debuted to 22 million people now had fewer viewers than some local news broadcasts. The network's response to this decline was interesting and reveals something important about how the economics of television have changed. In a previous era of television, a show whose viewership had declined to 723,000 viewers would have been canceled without much deliberation. That is not a viable audience for a broadcast network show, but Family Guy was not canceled. It was renewed, extended, kept on the schedule. The reasons are primarily economic and structural, and they have to do with the transformation of the television industry away from a purely ratings-driven model. Family Guy's value to Fox and Disney is not primarily measured by how many people watch new episodes on Wednesday nights. It is measured by the show's presence across a much wider ecosystem. It airs in reruns on Adult Swim, FXX, Comedy Central, and other cable networks. It streams on Hulu as one of the platform's more popular animated library titles. It generates licensing revenue from merchandise, video games, theme park attractions, and other brand extensions. It has a library of over 400 episodes that each generate revenue every time they are streamed or licensed. The cumulative value of that library is enormous in ways that a weekly Nielsen rating cannot capture. The move from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights in 2023 was the clearest public signal that the network understood what the show had become. Sunday night, animation domination was prime real estate on Fox. It was the network's identity. Moving Family Guy off that block and onto Wednesday was not a decision made casually. It was an acknowledgement that the show no longer functioned as a Sunday night headliner, that its audience had been declining to a point where its presence in the flagship lineup was more historical gesture than current achievement. The show that had once anchored the Sunday night block was now being placed somewhere quieter, somewhere expectations were lower, somewhere the comparison to what it used to be would not be made quite so directly every week. The irony of the show's persistence despite these numbers is that it actually proves something about the nature of television in the streaming era that is not entirely depressing. Family Guy continues to exist because people still watch it, just not in the specific way that broadcast television traditionally measured watching. The show's older episodes are some of the most streamed animated content on Hulu. Young viewers who were not born when the show premiered are discovering it now through streaming and through social media clips and through the specific internet culture of sharing out-of-context moments. The audience for Family Guy in 2025 is not the audience that watched it in 2005. It is a different audience, younger, more distributed, less attached to broadcast television as a viewing method, watching in different ways at different times. The show has not held its audience. It has cycled through multiple generations of audiences, each one finding it in their own way. The numbers, when you look at them completely, tell a story about a show that was always fighting for survival in different ways at different times. In the beginning, it fought for survival against bad scheduling and network indifference. In the middle period, it fought for survival against declining ratings and creative fatigue. In the present period, it survives through institutional inertia and a business model that no longer requires the same kind of live viewership numbers to justify a show's existence. Whether that survival constitutes success depends on what you think success looks like for a show in its 26th year. But the numbers are honest. They tell the truth about what happened to the audience, even if the show itself has spent years pretending nothing has changed. Section 16. What was never said. The unofficial oral history. There is a category of Family Guy history that lives not in public records or press releases or official statements, but in the recollections of the people who were in the building. The writers, the directors, the voice cast, the network executives, the production assistants who were 25 years old when the show was being made and are now in their late 40s. These are the people who know what the rooms were actually like, what the arguments were actually about, what the decisions that shaped the show actually felt like when they were being made rather than when they were being discussed in retrospect. This kind of oral history is hard to compile in a systematic way because the people who hold it are still working in the industry and are often still connected to the show or to Fox or to Seth MacFarlane through professional relationships. Speaking candidly about a show's internal dynamics while you are still trying to work in the same industry has costs. There are non-disclosure agreements and professional courtesy and the simple practical consideration that burning bridges with a major network entertainment franchise is not a wise career move. What gets said publicly tends to be careful, edited, shaped by these constraints. But things leak out in DVD commentaries, where people sometimes speak more freely than in formal interviews. In casual podcast appearances, where a writer who has been asked a direct question gives a more honest answer than the publicist's version. In the memories shared at industry events, at memorial tributes for colleagues who have passed, at the kinds of conversations that happen after several drinks at a television industry gathering where the camera is not running. A composite picture emerges from these fragments, and it is more textured and more honest than the official history. What that composite picture suggests is that the early writing room was a genuinely exciting creative environment where an unusual concentration of very funny people were working at the top of their ability on material that felt genuinely new. The people who were there during the first 3 seasons tend to describe the experience with a warmth and nostalgia that goes beyond the normal Hollywood nostalgia for youth and first successes. They describe it as a room where the material was good and everyone knew it, where there was genuine shared excitement about what the show was doing, where MacFarlane's involvement meant that every decision was being made by someone who cared deeply about getting it right. The revival-era writers' room was a different environment, more people, a more complicated creative hierarchy. The pressure of returning to a show that had developed a mythology during its absence and that had fans who were deeply invested in it continuing to be exactly what they remembered it being. The writers of seasons 4 and 5 describe working in the shadow of the earlier seasons, aware that comparisons were being made, aware that a version of the show existed in the culture's memory against which their work would be measured. This is a specific kind of creative pressure that the original writers did not have to deal with. They were making something new. The revival writers were continuing something beloved, which is a completely different creative problem. The writers who worked on the later seasons, the ones that corresponded to MacFarlane's diminished involvement, describe a room that was competent and professional, but that lacked the specific creative tension that the earlier rooms had. Good jokes were still being made. Good episodes were still being produced. But the sense of collective urgency, of everyone working toward the same vision of what the show should be, had dissipated. Different writers had different ideas about what Family Guy was. The show that resulted from those differing visions was more inconsistent, more variable in quality and tone from episode to episode than the earlier show had been. The relationship between the writers and the network is described in these informal oral history fragments as consistently contentious and occasionally absurd. Standards and practices notes on scripts were sometimes detailed in ways that required extensive negotiation to resolve. A joke that had been in the show in some form for years would suddenly be flagged as unacceptable because someone new had started paying attention. The reverse also happened. Content that seemed genuinely extreme got through the review process without comment because nobody happened to look at it carefully or because the reviewer did not have the cultural reference to understand what was being shown. MacFarlane's relationship with the room in his later period of involvement is described with a certain careful ambiguity by the people who worked around him. He was present enough to know what was happening. He had opinions. He was available for consultation. But the day-to-day creative decision-making had been passed to other people, and the difference between being an executive producer who could theoretically veto anything and being an executive producer who was actively making decisions every day was enormous in practice. The room ran on its own momentum most of the time. MacFarlane's voice was available, but it was not the constant presence that it had been in the early years. The question of whether the show knew it was declining is answered differently by different people who were involved with it. Some writers say the room had a clear awareness of the show's trajectory, that there were conversations about how to recapture what made the early seasons work, That specific decisions were made specifically to address the drift. Others describe an environment where the weekly production pressure was so consuming that long-term questions about the show's quality and direction got crowded out by the immediate demands of finishing this episode for this week's schedule. Both things can be simultaneously true in a production environment that runs on the compressed timeline that animation requires. What the unofficial oral history adds to the official record is texture and humanity. The official history of Family Guy is a story about decisions and numbers and cultural impact and industry dynamics. The unofficial history is a story about people, young people working intensely on something they loved, older people trying to maintain something that had been great, writers who gave years of their lives to a show and whose best work lives in episodes that are now watched by streaming algorithms and clip compilers rather than by the audiences who watched them live. The show exists in the official record as a product and a phenomenon. It exists in the unofficial record as a place where real human creativity happened, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes badly, always under conditions that were harder and more complicated than the audience ever knew. Section 17. The legacy they built without knowing it. Family Guy's actual cultural impact. When Family Guy premiered in 1999, the conversation about what the show might mean culturally had not yet begun because the show had not yet proven it would survive long enough to have a legacy. When it was canceled in 2002, the conversation about its cultural meaning seemed closed. When it came back in 2005 and entered the most commercially successful period of its existence, the conversation was mostly about ratings and renewals, and whether Seth MacFarlane was becoming too powerful in the Fox animation universe. The deeper conversation about what Family Guy was actually doing to American culture, what it was normalizing, and what it was challenging, and what it was teaching a generation of young viewers about comedy and family and social engagement, took much longer to develop. Family Guy was the first animated show to fully inhabit the internet age as a native cultural form. The Simpsons had been on the air for 10 years before the internet became a mass medium. South Park adapted to internet culture faster than The Simpsons did, but it was still a show made by people who had formed their sensibilities in a pre-internet creative environment. Family Guy launched in 1999 just as the first wave of internet culture was beginning to establish its specific aesthetics. The out-of-context clip, the quotable fragment, the shared reference that communicated community membership. The show's cutaway format was perfectly adapted to this emerging culture without being deliberately designed for it. The rise of YouTube in 2005, in the same year Family Guy returned from cancellation, created an environment where individual Family Guy cutaway gags could be isolated and shared as standalone content. A 30-second clip from a 2007 episode might get 10 million views on YouTube by 2010, independent of whether the viewer had ever watched the surrounding episode. This created a new relationship between the show and its audience, one where the unit of consumption was not the episode but the moment, and where the show's cultural influence was being transmitted through fragments rather than wholes. The Family Guy that most people encountered in the internet era was not the Family Guy that aired on Sunday nights. It was a decontextualized collection of bits, memes, and viral moments. This had interesting consequences. It meant that the show's worst characteristics, the overlong cutaways, the repetitive shock humor, the mean-spirited character treatment, were often filtered out of the viral versions that spread most widely. What spread were the genuinely funny moments, the clips that worked perfectly in isolation, the bits that were strong enough to survive decontextualization. The internet version of Family Guy was, paradoxically, a better version than the broadcast version, because the selection process for what was worth sharing was a quality filter that the broadcast version lacked. The show's influence on the generation of comedy writers and performers who grew up with it in the late 1990s and 2000s is substantial and difficult to fully document. The specific sensibility that Family Guy represented, the willingness to make dark jokes, the use of absurdist non sequitur, the collapse of pretension, the embrace of low culture references alongside high culture ones, became deeply embedded in the comedic vocabulary of a generation. Writers who are now in their 30s and 40s and working in television grew up watching Family Guy as adolescents and absorbed its specific approach to comedy in ways they may not always consciously recognize. The show's relationship with its own limitations also taught a generation something specific about self-referential humor and meta-comedy. Family Guy made jokes about its own structure, its own cancellations, its own relationship with the network, its own declining quality long before self-aware comedy became the dominant mode of American popular humor. The show modeled a specific stance toward its own artifice, a willingness to acknowledge that it was a television show made by human beings in specific circumstances for commercial purposes, that was ahead of its cultural moment and helped create the conditions for later shows and comedians to develop their own versions of that stance. The show's influence on animation, specifically, is even more direct. The post-Family Guy landscape of American adult animated comedy includes a remarkable number of shows that owe their existence to Family Guy, having proven that there was a market for adult animated content outside of The Simpsons and South Park model. Some of these shows are direct descendants in style, using cutaway gags and reference-heavy humor in ways that explicitly echo Family Guy's approach. Others are reactions against that approach, shows that deliberately made character and story primary in order to distinguish themselves from a model they found limiting. American Dad is the most important example of the latter, but it is far from the only one. The show's cultural legacy is also inseparable from its controversies. The banned episodes, the censored scenes, the Venezuelan ban, the lawsuits, the Parents Television Council campaigns, all of it became part of the show's identity and part of how its audience understood what the show was. Family Guy was the show that said the things other shows would not say. Whether it was always saying them well, or saying them for good reasons, or saying them in ways that held up to scrutiny, these were secondary questions for an audience that valued the gesture of transgression, independent of the quality of the transgression. This is not a purely admirable cultural position. A show that is brave does not always result in good art, but it created a specific cultural space that Family Guy occupied for a significant period of American television history, and that space mattered to the people who lived in it. The show's longest and most complicated legacy may be its relationship with the fan community that grew around it during the Adult Swim era and the early internet years. This community was unusually passionate and unusually capable of expressing its passion through the emerging tools of internet culture. They wrote fan fiction. They made fan art. They created edit compilations and tribute videos and critical analyses of individual episodes. They built wikis and fan sites and organized petitions. The Change.org petition that gathered 100,000 signatures after Brian's death was not a spontaneous expression of grief. It was the product of a fan community infrastructure that had been building for over a decade and that could mobilize quickly around a shared emotional cause. This community has watched the show change over the years with a combination of loyalty and frustration that is specific to long-form fandom. The early episodes that they love are still there, accessible in perpetuity through streaming and through personal libraries. The later episodes that disappointed them are also there, running on the same schedule, carrying the same title, featuring the same characters. The relationship between these two versions of the same show, the beloved early work and the disappointing later work, is one of the defining tensions of the Family Guy fan experience. You cannot fully love or fully leave a show that has both things in it. What Family Guy built across its long and complicated history was something more durable than any individual season or any specific critical reputation. It built a world, a specific set of characters with specific voices and specific relationships that became genuinely real to millions of people in the way that fictional characters become real when you have lived with them long enough. The fact that the show eventually mishandled those characters, pushed them in directions that damaged their relationships with the audience, does not erase the reality that for a specific period of time, those characters were some of the most beloved presences in American popular culture. That legacy is not revocable. It is not diminished by the later seasons. It is simply complicated by them, as all legacies eventually are. Section 18. The Giant Chicken. What the show's most absurd running gag really meant. There is one recurring element in Family Guy that appears across multiple seasons, generates enormous amounts of screen time, costs significant animation resources to produce, and has been the subject of surprisingly little serious analysis: the giant chicken fights. If you have watched even a handful of Family Guy episodes, you know what these are. Ernie the giant chicken shows up periodically throughout the show's run and gets into extraordinarily prolonged, elaborate physical battles with Peter Griffin. These fights last for minutes. They move through multiple locations. They are rendered with more visual detail and more kinetic energy than almost anything else in the show. And they always end with one or both of them apparently dead, only for the chicken to show up again multiple seasons later so the whole thing can happen again. The origin of the gag is simple enough. In the episode Da Boom, airing in 1999, Ernie the Giant Chicken offers Peter a coupon, and the coupon turns out to be expired. Peter attacks him. A fight breaks out. This is the joke, the disproportionate response to a minor social friction. The comedy is in the gap between the offense and the reaction, and it is completely in keeping with the show's early sensibility of finding humor in how extreme human impulses become when applied to situations that do not warrant them. But the chicken fights kept coming back, and they grew. Each subsequent fight was longer, more elaborate, and more graphically violent than the last. By the later seasons, a chicken fight sequence could occupy 5 or more minutes of a 22-minute episode, which is a remarkable allocation of screen time for a recurring bit that had established its premise and punchline in its first appearance. The animation resources devoted to these sequences were significantly higher than those devoted to the surrounding episode content. Buildings were destroyed, cars were crashed, elaborate action movie set pieces were staged. The quality of the animation in these sequences was noticeably better than in the rest of the episodes that contained them. The chicken fights have been interpreted by fans and occasional critics in several ways. Some see them purely as a self-indulgent showcase for the animation team, a chance to produce action sequences that a comedy show would not otherwise justify. This interpretation has merit. The fights are technically impressive in ways that clearly required additional production resources, and there is a specific pleasure in seeing a show that normally operates within the visual vocabulary of the suburban comedy suddenly produce something that looks like it belongs in a different genre entirely. The tonal rupture is the point, or part of it. Others have read the chicken fights as a structural commentary on the show's own approach to extended gags, a self-referential acknowledgement that Family Guy was willing to take any bit further than it needed to go, that the show understood overindulgence as a form and was deliberately performing it. In this reading, the chicken fights are not just funny, they are the show thinking about what it is doing. They are the cutaway gag logic taken to its logical extreme. A joke that begins with a setup and refuses to end, that keeps escalating and escalating until it has consumed the episode around it. The most interesting reading, and the one that holds up best when you trace the chicken fights across the show's full run, treats them as a kind of emotional pressure valve. Peter's relationship with Ernie the Giant Chicken is, in its absurd way, one of the most consistent and most honest relationships in the show. It began with a grievance. It continues through periodic violent reckoning. It never resolves in any meaningful way because the show does not resolve anything in any meaningful way. But the fights themselves have a cathartic quality that the regular episodes often lack. When Peter fights the chicken, the stakes are somehow real in a way that they rarely are in his domestic or workplace storylines. The violence is extreme but consequence-free in the way that cartoon violence is supposed to be. And the return of the chicken, season after season, creates a specific kind of running thread in a show that otherwise resets itself episodically. There is also something interesting about what the chicken fight sequences say about the show's values in terms of craft. In a show that was accused, by South Park and by its own moments of self-awareness, of lazy writing and cheap comedy, the chicken fight sequences represent genuine care. The choreography is inventive. The staging is thoughtful. The escalation within each fight follows an internal logic. These sequences were made by people who gave a real artistic effort to something that existed outside the main narrative of the episode, that contributed nothing to character development or plot, and that justified itself purely on the terms of whether it was visually and kinetically exciting to watch. And it was. The chicken fights are consistently among the most rewatchable sequences in the show's run. And they are rewatchable not in spite of their absurdity, but because of the genuine skill applied to the absurdity. The most recent chicken fight sequences in the later seasons felt different from the early ones in a way that is hard to articulate but worth trying. The early fights had a manic, slightly out-of-control energy, as though even the animators were surprised by how far things were going. The later fights felt more choreographed, more managed, more aware of their own status as an institution within the show's history. They were delivering a known product rather than discovering something. That is the natural evolution of any recurring element. What begins as an accident becomes a tradition, and traditions become less surprising even when they remain impressive. The chicken fights are a microcosm of the show's larger arc, from accidental discovery to deliberate execution to institutional repetition, each stage producing different results from the same basic materials. The giant chicken himself is a fascinating figure in the show's mythology. He has a name, Ernie. He has a wife. He has a life outside his periodic battles with Peter. In some episodes, glimpses of that life are shown, creating an odd humanization of what is otherwise simply an obstacle for Peter's aggression. The show occasionally toyed with the idea of giving the chicken a full backstory, of exploring the original grievance over the expired coupon and whether it might be resolved. These moments were always played with the show's characteristic ironic detachment, as though the writers were amused by the idea of taking the premise seriously without actually committing to doing so. The chicken fight sequences, in all their excess and their visual ambition, are one of the clearest examples of what Family Guy was best at. Finding a completely unexpected register for a show to occupy and committing to it fully enough that the register becomes coherent on its own terms. You watch a chicken fight sequence and you know, completely, that you are watching Family Guy. Not because of the characters or the setting or the comedic sensibility, but because of the specific combination of cartoon excess and production investment and tonal rupture that only this show was willing to produce. That combination is the show's fingerprint. It is present in the best work and in the worst work, and in every chicken fight sequence in between. Section 19. Where the show goes from here. The future of a show that refused to die. Family Guy was renewed in April 2025 for 4 additional seasons in what was described as a mega deal with Disney, extending the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season and taking it to its 30th anniversary. Each season under this renewal consists of 15 episodes. The show will continue to air on Fox. Seth MacFarlane will continue to provide voices. The writing staff will continue to produce scripts. The animation studios will continue to deliver finished episodes. Everything that needs to happen for the show to continue will happen because the infrastructure and the contracts and the economic logic all point in the same direction. But what the show will be creatively in those additional seasons is a different question. The cultural moment that made Family Guy feel necessary in 1999 no longer exists. The specific combination of circumstances that made a cutaway-heavy animated comedy featuring an irreverent working-class family feel transgressive and new is long past. The audience that will watch those future episodes will be watching something that is now genuinely an institution, a show that has been around for longer than many of its current viewers have been alive. What relationship an institution has with relevance and freshness is one of the most interesting questions in the long history of American popular entertainment. The Simpsons provides the most instructive precedent. The Simpsons has been running since 1989. It is now in its 36th season. The critical consensus is that the show peaked somewhere around seasons 3 through 8, that it declined through the 1990s and 2000s, and that it has been operating for many years as an institution rather than as a creative force. People still watch it. New episodes are still made, the characters are still recognizable. But the cultural conversation around the show has long since moved on from questions of quality to questions of legacy and historical significance. The Simpsons is no longer a show that people talk about for what it is doing. It is a show that people talk about for what it was. Family Guy is approaching that same transition, if it has not already made it. The cultural conversations that generate the most engagement around the show are almost always about the early seasons, about specific beloved episodes, about what the show was before it became what it is. The newer seasons generate discussion primarily when something unusual or controversial happens, when the Brian Death-type stunt creates a news cycle, when a politically charged episode attracts attention from outside the show's regular audience. The week-to-week creative output of the current Family Guy does not drive cultural conversation in the way that the early seasons did. This is not necessarily a problem for the show's continued existence. It may simply be what a 30-year-old television show is. an institution rather than a conversation, a comfort rather than an event. The people who watch Family Guy now are watching it in a specific way, relaxed, familiar with the rhythms of the show, not expecting to be surprised but finding genuine pleasure in the company of characters they have known for a very long time. That is a legitimate relationship to have with a piece of entertainment. It is the relationship most people have with the music they listened to when they were young, the books they return to in adulthood, the films that feel like home rather than like discovery. Familiarity and comfort are real values, even if they are not the same values as innovation and surprise. The question of what happens to the show after McFarlane is no longer providing voices is one that has rarely been discussed publicly, but that must be part of the thinking around any renewal that extends the show's run for years into the future. McFarlane is currently in his early 50s. He is in good health by all available evidence. There is no reason to expect any change in his ability to continue providing the voices of Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire for the foreseeable future. But animation shows have a history of navigating voice cast changes in ways that range from seamless to traumatic, and a show whose central voice cast includes a single actor playing four of the principal characters would face a specific kind of challenge if that actor were for any reason unavailable. The Cleveland voice casting change, when Mike Henry stepped down from the role in 2020 and was replaced by Arif Zahir, was managed with relatively little disruption. The character continued. The show continued. The change was noted and discussed, and then absorbed into the ongoing life of the production. But Cleveland, while important, was not the center of the show in the way that Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire are. A change to any of those voices would be felt differently. The show's future is, in the end, a business story more than a creative story. It continues because it is profitable and because the business model of modern entertainment, with its streaming libraries and licensing revenues and brand extension possibilities, makes the ongoing production of content in known universes more economically sensible than the development of new ones. Family Guy will continue to be made as long as making it is more economically rational than not making it. Whether the show that results from those future seasons will be worth watching is a question that the economic model does not answer and does not need to answer. What will persist, regardless of what the future seasons look like, is the work already done. The early episodes are not going away. The banned episodes are still on DVD. The recording sessions are still in the archive. The interviews and the public statements and the behind-the-scenes stories that have accumulated across 25 years of production are still out there, accessible to anyone who wants to know the full story of what this show was and how it got to be what it became. That story, the full one, is the story told here across these many hours and these many words. A show born from a young creator's ambition, nearly killed by a network's indifference, resurrected by audience love and commercial logic, changed by time and turnover and the accumulated weight of decisions made for reasons that had little to do with art, and sustained across decades by a combination of inertia and genuine human affection for the characters at its center. It is, when you look at it from far enough away, a pretty good story. Not the story the show told about itself. The other one. The real one. The one happening in all the rooms the cameras never saw. All of these stories, taken together, paint a picture of a show that was always more complicated than it appeared to be. There is a specific kind of knowledge that changes how you watch something. Not the kind that ruins the experience, but the kind that deepens it. The kind that makes you see the thing you are watching in layers. The surface, and beneath the surface, and beneath that, the conditions under which the surface was made. Knowing the history of Family Guy, the real history with all its hidden chapters and corporate conflicts and creative compromises and banned episodes and deliberate manipulations and sincere passions, gives you that kind of knowledge. The show you watch after knowing all of this is the same show and a different show simultaneously. You see the joke on the screen, and you also see the conversation in the network office that almost prevented it. You see the character behaving a certain way, and you also see the writing room debate about whether that behavior had gone too far. You see the show continuing, and you also see the creator who made it going public about his wish that it was on a different network entirely. The cancellations were not just business decisions. The censored episodes were not just network squeamishness. The Brian death stunt was not just a ratings trick. The Stewie ambiguity was not just clever writing. The McFarlane departure was not just a creator moving on to new things. Each of these stories contains layers that the official narrative never fully accounted for. And those layers, when you look at them closely, tell you something important about how television actually works, about the distance between what a show is trying to be and what it is allowed to be, between the version that exists and the version that could have existed if different decisions had been made in different rooms. The most honest version of Family Guy's history is one where every era of the show was shaped by forces that are invisible to the casual viewer. The scheduling that killed it the first time was not random. The writing staff turnover that changed its voice after the revival was not inevitable. The censorship that kept specific episodes from American screens was not simply about protecting sensitive viewers. The departure of its creator from the writing room was not a story of peaceful transition. The death of Brian was not a brave creative risk. Every single thing that happened to this show happened because someone made a decision, and most of those decisions were made for reasons that had nothing to do with whether the result was good television. That gap between the decision and the artistic justification that was offered for it afterward is where most of the truth about Family Guy lives. It is not a comfortable gap to sit with, but it is an honest one. This is not unique to Family Guy. Every television show that runs for a long time accumulates a hidden history like this. The difference is that Family Guy ran long enough and was significant enough and involved a creator vocal enough about his relationship with his network and his own show that more of the hidden history became visible than is typical. McFarlane's tweets about Fox News, his references to a failing marriage with the network, his Reddit AMA admissions about his writing room departure, the leaked information about the banned episode scripts, the DVD extras that showed what the broadcast versions had removed. All of these created unusual windows into a creative ecosystem that television shows generally work hard to keep opaque. What you see through those windows is not a simple story of corporate villainy and creative martyrdom. It is something more complicated and more human than that. A young creator with genuine talent who built something remarkable and then watched it become an institution that he could not fully control and could not fully leave. A network that valued the property enough to keep it alive, but not enough to give its creator the autonomy he would have needed to protect the thing that made the property valuable in the first place. A fan community that loved something enough to bring it back from the dead, and then watched, over many years, as the thing they loved it became something else. Something that still carried the name and the faces and the voices they had fallen in love with, but that felt fundamentally different in ways they could not always articulate. There is a version of this story that is purely critical. Family Guy was made by talented people, was shaped by corporate decisions and creative fatigue, and now continues as a version of itself sustained by inertia and revenue. That version is not wrong exactly, it just is not complete. The more complete version acknowledges that the show produced genuinely extraordinary work. The first 3 seasons contain episodes that stand with the best American animated comedy ever made. The revival seasons produced episodes that people still quote and reference 20 years later. The road to episodes featuring Brian and Stewie at their best combined genuine wit with genuine emotional warmth in ways that should not have worked in an animated comedy and somehow did. The episode Brian and Stewie, with its locked vault conversation structure and complete absence of the show's normal comedic mechanisms, demonstrated that the people making the show were capable of formal ambition when they were allowed to be. The musical sequences, the Star Wars parody episodes, the specific pleasure of hearing Peter Griffin's voice say something so stupid that your brain briefly short-circuits, these things were real. They had genuine value. They made real marks on real people who watched them. The cover-ups do not erase any of that. They contextualize it. They explain why the show that contained those moments also contained long stretches of material that seemed to have forgotten what the show was supposed to be. They explain the distance between what the show could do at its best and what it defaulted to when nobody was pushing it toward its best. They explain why a show with extraordinary resources, a talented voice cast, a large writing staff, decades of institutional knowledge, kept producing work that felt less than it should have. When you look at the full picture, when you lay out the scheduling wars and the censored scripts and the ratings freefall and the creator's public frustration with his own network and the systematic treatment of a character as a punching bag for 10 years, and the calculated emotional manipulation of a death that was always going to be reversed. What you see is not a show that failed. What you see is a show that survived. That is the more accurate framing. Family Guy was canceled twice, stripped of its writing staff twice, given hostile scheduling, had episodes banned, had its creator undermined by his own network during a labor dispute, and it survived all of it. The character that emerged from all that survival is different from the character that entered. But survival changes things. That is not a judgment. That is just how it works. The baby in the football-shaped head and the yellow shirt who wanted to take over the world had a whole universe behind him. Most of it never made it to your screen. Not the banned episodes, not the canceled scripts about Stewie, not the recording session improvisations, not the jokes that got too dark for standards review and were cut in the editing room, not the internal conversations about what the show was losing and whether anyone was going to fight to get it back. Not the full scope of what Seth MacFarlane actually felt about the network whose name was on the show he had made. What did make it to your screen was enough. Enough to build a community. Enough to survive 2 cancellations and come back stronger. Enough to generate the kind of cultural conversation that still produces video essays and fan analyses and late-night arguments about which season peaked and which character declined the most and what the show would have been if things had gone differently. If things had gone differently. That is the phrase at the heart of every one of these stories. If Fox had given the show stable scheduling in its first run, it might have found a broader audience before the cancellation and returned with different energy. If the original writing staff had stayed intact through the revival, the transition might have been smoother. If the censored episodes had aired, the show's relationship with its audience around difficult content might have developed differently. If MacFarlane had stayed in the writing room, the character arcs might have held together better. If the Brian death had been permanent, the show might have taken a genuinely interesting direction. If the comedy had remained tethered to character and consequence, the later seasons might have kept more of the audience that the earlier ones earned. None of those things happened. The things that happened instead are the actual history. And the actual history is worth knowing in full, with all its hidden layers and quiet compromises and decisions made in rooms where the cameras were not running and the audience was not watching. Because television, at its best, is one of the most honest mirrors a culture has of itself. And the lies told around television, the official stories that smooth over the complicated truths, are some of the most revealing lies of all. Family Guy contains a remarkable amount of the story of American television, from 1999 to the present. The early episodes contain the story of a young creative talent exploding onto the cultural scene with something genuinely new. The cancellation and revival contain the story of corporate television's relationship with audience loyalty and commercial value. The censored episodes contain the story of what American broadcast television was and was not willing to say about the country's most contested questions. The character arcs contain the story of what happens to fictional people when the humans responsible for them stop caring about their inner lives. The ratings decline contains the story of the fragmentation of the mass television audience and the emergence of new ways of watching. And running through all of it, the story of a man who made something that outlasted his passion for it, who gave his voice to characters for decades after the creative work that gave those characters their souls had been transferred to other hands. That is a rich and strange and very human story. It is not the story of a beloved cartoon. It is the story of a beloved cartoon and everything that surrounded it and shaped it and constrained it and eventually changed it into something its creator might not fully recognize if he saw it without knowing it was his. The show is still running. New episodes will continue to be made and broadcast and streamed for at least the next few years. The Griffin family will continue to have adventures in a town that has been their home for over a quarter century. Peter will continue to be reckless. Lois will continue to manage the fallout. Chris will continue to be clueless. Stewie will continue to be complicated in ways the show sometimes acknowledges and sometimes avoids. Brian will continue to be a version of something that used to be one thing and became another. And in the background of all of it, invisible to the audience but present in every frame, the accumulated weight of every hidden decision and every covered-up story and every version of the show that existed only in a writing room or a network office or a creator's imagination, before it was changed into something more acceptable and more profitable and slightly less true. The baby who wanted to take over the world never quite made it, but he made it further than anyone expected. And the story of how far he actually got, the full story with all its hidden chapters, is worth knowing in the dark, at whatever quiet hour you have found yourself in listening to this. Rest well. And the next time an episode plays on whatever screen is closest to you, and you see those characters doing whatever they are doing this season, maybe you will think about all of it. The thing you are watching and the many things you are not. The show that made it out and the show that stayed behind. The canceled scripts, the banned episodes, the recording booth at 2 in the morning, the network office where someone decided what you were and were not allowed to see, the writing room that shifted and changed and lost and rebuilt itself so many times that the show it produced in year 20 barely resembled the show it produced in year 1. All of that is part of what you are watching, even when none of it is visible. The history is in there, layered into every frame, whether it was ever supposed to reach you or not. That space between them is where all the most interesting stories lived. It is where the real show existed. And you have spent tonight in that space. That is not nothing. That is precisely what this channel is here to do. To sit in the dark with you and go deeper than the surface version of things. To find the story underneath the story. To give you something to hold on to when sleep is slow in coming and the night feels longer than it should. The Griffin family lives on your screen. Their history lives here with us in the hours most people are asleep. If you made it to the end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you being here. This was a long one, and you stayed with it, and that means something real. Drop a comment and tell me your favorite Family Guy secret you had not heard before tonight. Tell me which section surprised you the most. Tell me whether knowing all of this changes how you feel about the show or whether it just adds another layer to something you already loved for complicated reasons. And if any of this kept you company through some quiet hours, that means everything. Hit subscribe if you have not already. It takes 2 seconds and it keeps this kind of deep dive content coming. I will see you in the next one. Rest well.